Chapter 3:15. The 30 minutes between classes quickly passed by. The second class was Professor Ka Zayer's Introduction to Magic. Although Luo Boat looked relaxed, that wasn't the case. Just like White said, he talked too much. This was actually a way to hide his inner thoughts. But White didn't think too deeply about it. In class, Luo Boat couldn't hear Professor Ka Zayer's words at all. He was almost always thinking about things related to Blood Concubine. Although the book, 300 Heroes, clearly recorded that Blood Concubine Ophelia Bullard was a human from a minority tribe, humans didn't have pointed ears and fangs. Although the portrait of Blood Concubine in 300 Heroes, and the female vampire he saw in the fog had the same face, it gave him the feeling that they were two completely different people. Blood Concubine was gentle and beautiful. If it wasn't for her dark red hair that was too dark and destroyed her quiet and virtuous temperament, she would look like a nun from the Holy Church. Of course, she wasn't the Sister Carl Yen type. Website: https://m. Vipkanchu. VIP Luo Boat also learned to read in the church. The one who taught them was the nun from that church. Although the nun wasn't beautiful, she had a pure temperament that made people want to get close to her. He couldn't forget it. And the portrait of Blood Concubine gave him such a feeling. Of course, a portrait was a portrait. It was very likely that there would be a slightly different expression due to the subjective wishes of the author. But the female vampire he saw in the mist and the portrait were two completely different sides of the female vampire. The female vampire gave him a feeling of awe and terror. Thus, Luo Boat couldn't help but think, could that Blood Concubine have been bitten by a vampire? After a human was embraced by a vampire, they would become a blood slave. Then, their bloodline would be purified step by step, and they could advance to become a blood demon, and finally a vampire. Blood Concubine was the last of her kind, but she disappeared soon after stepping onto the battlefield. Her whereabouts were suspicious. There were no records of her in the book. It didn't even mention whether she was alive or dead. This was actually very rare. A hero of the Golden Era, a hero who came from the same Shang Malian as the Brave One and the Valkyrie, should not be abandoned by others. This meant that there must be something hidden. Luo Boat vaguely felt that he had run into something big. But he didn't want White to know. He had always been a straightforward person and would say anything on the spot. However, he had encountered a lot of things in the past half a year. He had finally grown up and changed a little. White had just fallen out of love yesterday. As his best friend, Luo Boat really didn't want to add more weight to his shoulders. Originally, when AI Ma bluntly pointed out that he was the one who led White astray, he secretly remembered it in his heart. It wasn't easy for Victor to take his studies seriously this semester. He didn't want to disrupt White's study because of him. A teenager's thoughts would always become complicated as he grew up. Luo Boat hid his panic and decided to investigate by himself first. If he really couldn't, he would ask White for help, or simply ask Dake for help. In fact, Dake Dimeng was also thinking about something similar. There was a well-known path from humans to vampires. When Dake talked with Luo Boat, he vaguely felt that something was wrong. Now he finally thought of this point. But this was only a guess based on the current information. There was no conclusive evidence. And after thinking about this point, the irritation in his heart didn't subside. Why do I feel like I've overlooked something? Is there some information that hasn't been connected? Dake couldn't help but ponder. Although his pride was growing every month, he had always thought that he was quite modest. For example, he had a clear understanding of his own IQ and never thought of himself as a very smart person. The reason why his comprehension ability was not bad was that he had received a complete compulsory education and had a set of systematic logical thinking. But when he encountered a real problem, he didn't have the kind of genius to break through the barriers. So he would ask the professor and Panduola for advice. It was precisely because of his calm state of mind that he was able to calm down and think carefully when he encountered a difficult problem. The Magic Guide class passed quickly. After that, it was time to eat and rest. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he walked into the classroom and prepared for the History of Magic class. But as soon as he sat down, he suddenly had a flash of inspiration. Yes, The history of magic class. How could I forget about this? Dake immediately took out the history of magic class notebook. Professor Ryan Harks once gave an assignment in the history of magic class. The students were asked to choose a traitor who was famous in history and write a small paper about him. Dake chose to evaluate one of the war criminals who escaped from Bardia prison on Christmas Day, Olivia Copernicus. Because of the deep impression of the Copernicus family name, Dake chose her as his evaluation subject and conducted a certain degree of research on her. Olivia Copernicus. Ophelia Bullard. There was a subtle similarity between the two names. The blood princess Olivia Bullard had long dark red hair and delicate facial features. The wanted criminal, Olivia Copernicus, was a woman with long, wine-red hair. Both had red hair, and it was easy to give a similar impression. But what was the similarity between the two? Dake really couldn't say for a while. Olivia Copernicus suddenly appeared at the end of the war and was wanted by the Holy Church. Before that, there was no record of her. It was as if she had appeared out of thin air. The appearance of the Golden Generation was actually at the end of the war. It took them about 10 years to completely end the war. It was at that time that Ophelia Bullard disappeared. Looking at the timeline, there was no overlap between the records of the two. It was possible that they were the same person. Both of them had different hair colors and appearances, but upon closer inspection, one would find that there were more similarities between them. Dake took the photo of the wanted poster from the newspaper and put it together with the portrait in 300 Heroes. The perspective became very intuitive. The similarity of their facial features made them look like a pair of sisters. In the world of magic, the ability to completely change one's appearance existed, let alone this level of disguise. Finally, Olivia Copernicus was a mixed blood. A hybrid of human and vampire. The uniqueness of the bloodline of vampires had been mentioned before. In theory, there was no such thing as a hybrid vampire in this world. This was because the vampire bloodline was extremely corrosive. It would transform all other bloodlines in the body into vampire blood. Therefore, there was only a difference between the inferior and superior bloodlines. There was no such thing as a hybrid bloodline. However, Olivia Copernicus was indeed a hybrid vampire. This kind of existence that went beyond theory and common sense generally had the ability to go beyond theory and common sense. For example, blood magic. Dake had previously guessed that Olivia Copernicus might have a special power that could resist the corrosion of the vampire bloodline. Now, the appearance of blood magic made up for this conjecture. It was like two pieces of a puzzle that could be put together. So, was this inevitable, or was it a coincidence? Dake Dimming, stand up and tell me, where was I? The causes of war, Professor. So, what are the causes of war? The causes of war include ZZ, economic, social, cultural, and many other factors. Dake calmly dealt with Professor Ryan Huck's sudden questions. He knew that the professor had caught him deep in thought just now. Fortunately, he still had one ear to listen to the lecture. Very good. I didn't expect you to have such a deep understanding of war at such a young age. You are indeed the son of the Valkyrie. Dake Dimming, 5 points. Professor Ryan Huck's words were filled with emotion. Dake, who had unexpectedly received 5 academic points, sat down again and continued to think about the relationship between the bloody concubine and the hybrid vampire. In the same class, the professor rarely called on the same person more than twice in a row. Therefore, he was basically safe now. As for the other person who was called to answer questions because he was distracted, he was not so lucky. Professor Ryan Hucks is not a hero who was active in the Golden Era. I shouldn't be able to get anything out of him. Professor Ka Zayer, Professor Li Li, and the others are also new professors. If you want to know more about the bloody concubine's life, you can only go to Principal A. Erti or Professor Shi Erfu. If only Claire was still here. Dake felt a little tired when he thought about having to find the elusive principal and Professor Shi Erfu, who threw wine at him. Of course, his relationship with Professor Shi Erfu was actually not that bad. They were still in the process of cooperation. But thinking about it, Dake suddenly realized that he did not have a reason to investigate the relationship between the bloody concubine and the hybrid vampire. If there's no reason, then find a reason. Scarlet Blood Concubine, Hybrid Vampire, Vlad the Vampire. Isn't everyone blood? Anything that had something to do with Vlad the Vampire was a reason. If the bloody concubine Luo Boat saw in the fog was really the same person as the hybrid vampire, then I have to be careful. Or rather, I have to be careful even now. Thinking about this. Dark stopped thinking about it blindly and started to listen to Ryan Huck's lecture seriously. Humans were really interesting creatures. With the help of Professor Ka Zayer, Ryan Hux put on high-end artificial limbs and eyes, and with the help of Sister Ka Lien, he grew thick hair. He could no longer let himself be sloppy. Every day, whether it was his hairstyle or his clothes, he became more and more exquisite. The current Professor Hux was really as handsome as he bragged. He looked like a handsome uncle. His image changed, and so did the way and content of his lectures. He began to not only tell stories, but also talk about the meaning of war, the inevitability of war, and other metaphysical theoretical issues. Occasionally, he would also explain some tactics. That was probably the essence of his entire lecture. Ring ring ring. With the end of the History of Magic class, the whole day of classes finally came to an end. Although there was still a lot of homework to do, Dake still said goodbye to D. Anna and Luo C. and went straight to Professor Shi Erfu's office alone. Just like how Luo Boat didn't want White to worry, Dake actually didn't want D. Anna and Luo C. to get involved. He knocked on the door of the office and found Professor Shi Erfu in the office grading homework. For professors, grading homework was indeed a tough job. If they could make something like a homework grading machine, it should be able to sell a lot, right? This thought flashed through Dake's mind. Dimming, what's the matter? Professor Shi Erfu looked up at the future Duke, who was still as elegant as ever, and asked. Dake locked the door and moved a stool to sit in front of the desk. Then, he said to Professor Shi Erfu, Professor, I want to know some stories about Ophelia Bullard from you. Ophelia Bullard. Professor Shi Erfu couldn't help but put down his pen. His eyes drifted away as if he was reminiscing. No one has mentioned her in front of me for a long time. How did you think of investigating her? The first thing he said was, investigating? Dake thought for a bit and said, it's like this, last night in the astronomy class. There was no need to hide this information from Professor Shi Erfu. Dake then told him what happened last night in the astronomy class. Professor Shi Erfu couldn't help but frown. So something like this happened? Did Midya not report it at all? Did you leak information about the vampire Vlad to her? Dake shook his head slightly. The vampire Vlad's name has spread, but we didn't mention any information about him. Professor Shi Erfu said in a low voice, the seal of the secret passage hasn't moved either. It hasn't made a move yet. I just don't know. Is it not interested in Vlad? Or is it too cautious? Dake changed the topic. Professor, let's talk about the bloody concubine. Bloody concubine? That's a very straightforward name. Professor Shi Erfu sighed slightly. There was a trace of regret on his face. Ophelia Bullard was a very gentle and kind child. Unfortunately, fate doesn't favor you just because you are a good person. She met with misfortune in her first year of school. Her entire clan was wiped out by vampires. If we don't take into account the hidden clansmen who are in exile, she should be the last princess of the bloody concubine. It's not a problem to call her the bloody concubine. Dake asked, then why did she go missing on the battlefield? Shi Erfu shook his head. I didn't go to the front line. Dake couldn't help but feel disappointed. But Professor Shi Erfu immediately added, that being said, when the report of her disappearance came out, we as professors did a special investigation. Wait a moment. After saying that, Professor Shi Erfu got up from his seat, turned around, and went to the bookcase full of books and documents, and carefully rummaged through it. She seemed to have put everything she had for decades in this bookcase. It was full of things. Dake paid a bit of attention. Professor Shi Erfu's hair color was very similar to Luo C's. Both of them had light blonde hair that looked ethereal from a distance, as if it would vanish into thin air if one wasn't careful. Her ears were long and pointy, which was rare among half-elves. They were almost as long as elves' ears. Originally, half-elves' ears were slightly shorter than elves, and the tips of their ears were slightly rounder. However, Professor Shi-Erfu seemed to have a very strong elven bloodline. The obvious difference in appearance between her and the pure-blooded elves was probably due to the difference in their figures. Pure-blooded elves were synonymous with delicate and slender. It wasn't that none of them were plump, but there were very few of them. Professor Shi-Erfu's figure, on the other hand, was so curvaceous that even the old-fashioned and loose magic robe on her couldn't cover it up. Dake had once entered Professor Shi-Erfu's dormitory during Christmas. At that time, Professor Shi-Erfu was wearing home clothes that accentuated her figure. Whether it was in terms of beauty or heart, she wasn't inferior to Principal Arti. While he was thinking, Professor Shi-Erfu had already straightened her back. She pulled out a rolled-up file from a large number of documents stacked at the bottom of the bookcase and was unwrapping the string to confirm it. "This is it." She heaved a sigh of relief, flattened the file, shook off the dust, and then pushed it on the table to Dake. Dake reached out and took it. There wasn't much written information in this stack of files, but there were a lot of photos and other things in it, making the entire file bulge. "Take a look first," Professor Shi-Erfu said. After Dake flattened it again, he read it carefully. The information about Bloody Concubine was a record of her journey from the beginning of her joining the army until she disappeared. Bloody Concubine had graduated in the same batch as Hero, Valkyrie, Sage of Beasts, and others. She had chosen to join the army at the beginning of her graduation. Of course, the Alliance army wouldn't reject powerful forces like them who were born in the academies. Soon, almost all of them were assigned to the positions that required them. Because Bloody Concubine was the last of the Blood Clan, she wasn't arranged to be on the front lines at first. She was even a target of protection. The Alliance army hoped that with her help, they could make strategic arrangements against vampires and treat some of the injured who had been harmed by blood magic. Bloody Concubine had originally joined the army for revenge, so this position suited her perfectly. Thus, she settled down in the strategy department against vampires in that military region. In the beginning, everything went very smoothly. Her research on blood gave her a very deep understanding of the human body, and her results in treating and saving people were remarkable. The terrifying blood magic became a divine spell in her hands to treat and save people. Vampires were originally high-level demons who rarely came out. Their true numbers weren't many, so Bloody Concubine's work in the strategy department wasn't busy. In order to better help the army, she gradually went in and out of the medical department more often. Because of her gentle and kind nature, as well as her superb treatment methods, she was deeply respected and liked by the soldiers. The name, concubine, also known as princess, gradually spread. On the battlefield, heroes who killed enemies at the front lines weren't the only ones who were considered heroes. Those who schemed at the back and saved the dying and the injured were also heroes. Bloody Concubine was a genuine hero. The number of people who gained life and even returned to the battlefield because of her was as many as the stars in the sky. If this continued, she might become a character like the Holy Mother of the battlefield. But the more famous she was, the greater the danger. The vampires, who saw the Blood Clan as a thorn in their side, wouldn't let her rise. On a certain night, the sudden swarm of bats passed through the barrier without making a sound. Relying on strange magic, they avoided all the vampires who were investigating and arrived at the rear of the military headquarters without any scruples. Then, they began to hunt her down and kill her. Brett God was there at that time? When Dake saw this, he couldn't help but exclaim. Professor Shi-Erfu's face didn't show any joy. She calmly said, "At that time, there was a last-minute plan to implement, so brave Brett came from another military region to help. Although it was just a coincidence, it was undoubtedly lucky." The strength of the high-level vampires was beyond the reach of ordinary soldiers at that time. Brett God's existence provided great support for the regrouping and counterattack of the rear troops. The Holy Sword of the Light Element was a great restraint against the vampires of the Dark Element. Brett, who summoned a batch of Holy Swords, was even able to fight against more than 10 vampires by himself. That was also one of the battles that made him famous on his path to rapid growth. The so-called brave title wasn't something he was born with. Before Brett God's rise, he could only be regarded as a brave reserve. There were many people with similar talents as him. But in the end, he was the only brave. But in that battle, Brett was still immature. Although his personal combat strength had gradually taken shape, he was still very lacking in terms of leadership and tactics. In the midst of the battle, Brett even forgot about the person he needed to protect. This became the fatal mistake of the entire battle. Although Ophelia Bullard was not weak, the vampires were also targeting the Fresh Blood tribe while the Fresh Blood tribe was targeting the vampires. Ophelia Bullard's strength was greatly suppressed under the joint attack of several vampires. In the end, the battle continued. Brett God was held back. Ophelia Bullard was seriously injured and captured. The vampires didn't kill her on the spot. Instead, they held her hostage and quickly fled. In the blink of an eye, they turned into bats and disappeared into the horizon. It was only then that Brett God suddenly woke up. He ignored the dissuasion and went alone to save the Blood Maiden. But half a month later, when Brett God appeared in the military camp again, Ophelia Bullard wasn't by his side. Professor Shi Erfu had sent a joint letter with a few past professors to inquire, but Brett God didn't give them the answer they wanted. He didn't say that she was dead, nor did he say that she was still alive. He just couldn't find her. If they couldn't find her, then there was nothing they could do. But the professors all knew that Brett God was a very mischievous person when he was a student. He wasn't as upright as the rumors said. Instead, he was a noble boy who was very good at lying. But the letter he replied to was full of mistakes. It wasn't like him at all. The professors came to a general consensus. Ophelia Bullard was most likely still alive, but for some reason, she couldn't appear in public. Brett was protecting her. Under such circumstances. Of course, the professors weren't stupid enough to expose this information. They immediately decided to stop investigating. Now that things had changed, there was no point in continuing to keep the secret. That was why Professor Shi Erfu took out this information. After Professor Shi Erfu saw that Dake had finished reading the information, he put down his teacup and sighed. Our common understanding at the time is the same as what you're thinking now. It's very likely that after Ophelia was captured, she received the vampire's embrace and became a low-level blood slave. After a human is transformed into a blood slave, their rational side will temporarily collapse, and they will become extremely bloodthirsty. And they have many weaknesses. Garlic, crosses, holy water, silver ornaments. Even sunlight can burn their skin. Vampirization of humans is irreversible, Lucian explained. In the situation at the time, once the fact that Ophelia had become a blood slave was exposed, she would definitely be executed on the spot. So many years have passed in the blink of an eye. Because Brett sacrificed himself in the final battle against the Demon King, we also lost the clue to find Ophelia. I don't know if she's still alive. If she's still alive, in what form is she alive in? The voices gradually died down. Dake listened up to this point and more or less had his own understanding of what had happened at the time. Then he took out the wanted poster, put it on the table, and turned his head. What's this? Professor Shi Erfu couldn't help but lower his head. Dake said, "Take a look. This is one of the fugitives who escaped from Badia prison on Christmas Day. After being recognized, it was published in the newspapers." Professor Shi Erfu didn't seem to have the habit of subscribing to the Great Sage daily. But it made sense. Elves had a quiet personality and liked peace and quiet. Professor Shi Erfu was also an elven envoy who was favored by the Wind Elves. She would probably rather walk in the forest than walk in the busy city. Her habit of not liking the secular world made her have little interest in the storms of the outside world. Perhaps all she wanted was to guard this small piece of land and live a peaceful and meaningful life. In Shang Malian Academy, as the vice principal, Professor Shi Erfu was in charge of internal affairs. Principal Aerti was basically in charge of external affairs. Of course, she must have her own channels to obtain information. She wasn't really stuck in a rut. Seeing the wanted poster, she was a little surprised and said, "I know someone escaped from prison, but what's so special about her? Wait, this is a vampire? Dake said, I've checked. It's recorded in the literature as a mixed-blood vampire. It's a very special term. A mixed-blood vampire? Professor Shi Erfu picked up the wanted poster and looked at it carefully. Then, he couldn't help but frown. A mixed-blood vampire who escaped from Badia prison, Olivia Copernicus. Is she related to Ophelia Blood? Dake took out his notebook, opened it, and handed it over. This is the information I collected for my homework on the history of magic. Professor Shi Erfu couldn't help but take the notebook and read it carefully. She was only halfway through, but her expression had already changed. When she finished reading, Dake could even see anger on her face. This was probably the first time he saw her so happy and angry. Bang! Professor Shi Erfu suddenly slammed the table and stood up. Dake looked at the notebook on the table with a distressed expression. The corners of his eyes twitched. Professor Shi Erfu glanced at him, then suddenly exhaled slowly and sat back down. How did you find so much information? Dake thought for a moment and said, The library. Professor Shi Erfu couldn't help but lean back in his chair. The library? I can't believe you were able to connect the two together. Dake asked, So, Professor, what's the relationship between them? Professor Shi Erfu said calmly, I'm not sure. But since you put the two together, I don't think I need to say more, right? Really? Dake whispered. Then, he looked up and said, Let's say we equate the two together. Then the person Luo Boat saw in the mist is this person. What's the mystery behind this? Divination. Professor Shi Erfu said slowly, I can only think of divination. Dake, but Professor Midya said it wasn't divination. Professor Shi Erfu looked into his eyes and said word by word, Then, how trustworthy do you think her words are? Dake was silent for a moment. Professor Midya's trustworthiness. To be honest, it was quite low. Prophets were all qualified actors. The more famous a prophet was, the better their acting skills were. A prophet like Professor Midya had probably reached the point of being able to predict everything. Last night at the top of the spiral clock tower, Dake couldn't tell how much of what Professor Midya said was true. Professor Shi Erfu looked at him and said, According to what you said, Luo Boat does have a talent for divination, so it's normal for him to trigger his first divination. We can use this as a basis for our calculations. Luo Boat is likely to encounter Ophelia in the future. So, where is the most likely place for him to encounter her? Dake said in a deep voice, Right here. Professor Shi Erfu, Ophelia is probably already at the school. Dake, the invisible person. Professor Shi Erfu, possibly. However, she immediately relaxed and said, Of course, this is just a guess, there's no evidence. Even if Ophelia wanted to invade the school, she wouldn't be able to do it silently. Dake thought carefully and said, It's possible. But we can't treat a hypothesis as a certainty. If Professor Midya isn't lying and Luo Boat isn't divining, then it's very strange that he can see scarlet blood concubine in the fog. Professor, I read in a book that vampires can only be reborn by parasitizing bats. Is this 100% certain? Professor Shi Erfu's eyes gradually turned cold. No. 4 in 1 8,000 completed. I suddenly received a WeChat message at 10 o'clock last night. Only then did I remember that today is my lunar birthday. Sigh, I'm going to sleep. When I wake up, I don't feel lonely anymore. I really hope that when I wake up, my birthday cake will be filled with monthly votes. Chapter 316. The Disintegration and Rebirth of a Vampire. In short, it was to transform oneself into a group of bats. Each of those bats was a clone of the vampire and contained all the factors needed to reconstruct the body. Therefore, as long as a vampire possessed one of the bats, he would be able to be reborn. But the above was only a general skill that all vampires could comprehend. High-level vampires could also parasitize other bats other than their own and obtain rebirth by modifying the bat's body. Of course, this type of rebirth would lead to serious injuries and a significant reduction in strength. In short, bats were a necessary carrier for a vampire's disintegration and rebirth. But this was actually not a necessary condition for rebirth. Because some vampires had a soul strength that exceeded the scope of ordinary vampires, they could use other means to bypass the necessary carrier for disintegration and rebirth. There were such methods, such as spectre transformation, evil spirit transformation, lich transformation, machine spirit transformation, and so on. Of course, after rebirth through these means, vampires would no longer be vampires. Remember the URL M. Vipkanchu. 6. They would lose most of their characteristics as vampires. Therefore, when Professor Shi Erfu said, not, he did not directly refer to the fact that vampires need bats as carriers for their disintegration and rebirth. Instead, it was an instinctive answer after considering that there were other possibilities for vampires to survive. This might cause some ambiguity, but after a clear explanation, it was fine. While Dake was slightly enlightened, Professor Shi Erfu continued to explain, however, creatures like vampires usually have very high self-esteem. They would rather die than give up their identity as vampires. Therefore, they rarely use other means to obtain rebirth. But this does not mean that they can only wait for death. Placing the soul in a living body temporarily and waiting for the perfect opportunity to be reborn would be a compromise. In fact, we had a similar speculation in the beginning, but the core of the detection at that time was on the white Gouda. Our habitual thinking tells us that even if vampires want to parasitize, they will choose the body of the brave ones. Therefore, the detection of other people was relatively neglected. Vampires were creatures that loved to enjoy life, and the word extravagant was a true description of this race. The so-called soul parasitism, simply put, was to treat a person's body as a house and temporarily live in it. White's body and Luo Boat's was like comparing a luxurious castle to a small thatched cottage. No one would think that a vampire would choose Luo Boat's body as a house. That was why the professors had given Vlad a chance to conceal himself during the body examination. Also, Vlad didn't try to take over Lucien's place in a radical way but only stayed there temporarily. He didn't show any abnormalities, so he was never discovered. However, Vlad's soul would continue to weaken if he didn't take over. Therefore, it would erupt sooner or later. However, Professor Shi Erfu had already noticed the oversight. If Luo Boat was summoned for a deeper examination, Vlad would probably be exposed. We were indeed negligent in this matter. If Vlad is indeed living in Luo Boat's body, then the reason why we couldn't find him in the secret passage is obvious. But this is only a possible speculation. In the current situation, there are two things we need to pay attention to. One is the return of Ophelia Bullard, and the other is the parasitism of the vampire's soul. Professor Shi Erfu stood up and gathered the information about the bloody concubine back into his hands. He rolled up the file and tied it with a rope. Just in case, we need to do some preparatory work first. Your behavior in the astronomy class last night may have alerted the enemy. She turned around and walked to the bookcase, putting the file back in its original place. Dake also organized his own information and put it back in his bag. He knew that he had to take action next. Not long after, Professor Ka Zayer hurried over after receiving the news from the Wind Sprite. After he entered, he said anxiously, "Shi Erfu, you said you found the vampire. Dake, you're here too?" "Good evening, Professor." Dake walked out from behind the door and waved at Professor Ka Zayer with a smile. "It's not evening yet, right?" Professor Ka Zayer asked casually. "Dake. Soon." The sun was setting in the west, and the evening glow was coming. It was very close to the time of encountering demons in the evening. Professor Ka Zayer saw that Dake was also here, and his anxiety gradually subsided. He said gently, "So, where exactly is the vampire? Is he dead or alive?" "Well, the vampire can't be said to be a living thing." Professor Shi Erfu looked at him and said seriously, "In fact, we're not sure. But it doesn't matter. We'll know after we go there." Professor Ka Zayer was confused. "So, what's the situation?" Professor Shi Erfu, "Our preliminary guess is that the vampire Vlad might be living in Luo Boat Brohim's body." Professor Ka Zayer heard this and couldn't help but frown. That's possible? But I didn't sense the vampire's aura on Brohim's body. Professor Shi Erfu said, maybe we didn't check carefully enough, so he escaped. However, Professor Ka Zayer said very decisively, no, I'm sure I checked very carefully. Professor Shi Erfu couldn't help but stop breathing. You're sure? Professor Ka Zayer nodded and said, of course, how could I joke about a student? Professor Shi Erfu said suspiciously, but during the moon god incident, Professor Ka Zayer's face turned red. That's two different things. Dake couldn't help but cover his head when he saw Professor Shi Erfu's disdain for EQ. Life is hard, don't expose him. Professor. However, Professor Ka Zayer's speech also exposed a big problem. Professor Shi Erfu obviously also realized this problem. She couldn't help but mutter, no, if Ka Zayer wasn't negligent, then the possibility of the vampire parasitizing Luo Boat's body is very low. But if it really did parasitize Luo Boat's body, then it means that it has a secret technique that can hide from Ka Zayer's senses. The situation is tricky. Magical technology was very lacking in the development of the brain and the soul. In this regard, Professor Ka Zayer could be considered the Shang Malian authority. If it could hide from Professor Ka Zayer, then the meaning of the prophecy was even more important than the fact that Luo Boat was parasitized itself. A vampire that was defeated by Dake Dimming. A vampire that couldn't even remember how many types of magic it knew. A vampire that only had the combat power of a level 7. Now, it suddenly became a vampire that could hide from Professor Ka Zayer's senses. Once this fact was established, the threat of the vampire Vlad would instantly skyrocket. And more importantly, even if they found Luo Boat now, they might not be able to confirm whether or not there was a vampire parasitizing his body. Professor Ka Zayer couldn't help but say solemnly, Shi Erfu, tell me the cause and effect. I'm still confused. Let me explain, Professor. Dake walked to the tea table and poured 2 cups of black tea, one for each of them. He then sat down and slowly explained. Since the matter had already developed to this point, there was no point in rushing it. Professor Ka Zayer patiently listened to him until he finished speaking. Only then did he realize. However, from his perspective, because he was not familiar with a blood concubine, he naturally did not empathize with her as much as Professor Shi Erfu. He analyzed, according to what you said, since the blood concubine Ophelia Blood and the escaped Olivia Copernicus are most likely the same person, then she should be a kind and gentle person, right? Even if such a person is really in the academy, we don't have to worry too much, right? Professor Shi Erfu couldn't help but nod. I still believe in Ophelia, so confirming this matter is not a high priority. Hearing this, Dake couldn't help but say, Professor, people change. Professor Shi Erfu said casually, didn't you write it in the information you collected? Olivia Copernicus originally turned herself in. Which vicious prisoner would turn herself in? Doc furrowed his brows. But she still managed to escape. Professor Shi Erfu said, she has been in Badia prison for more than 10 years. Also, you probably don't know that the heretics who launched a sneak attack on Badia prison at Christmas did not do so to save any prisoners. They only used this as a demonstration to spread terror. It just happened to give some prisoners a chance to escape. A person who turned herself in would escape. She must have her reasons. Dake opened his mouth. He knew that this matter didn't make sense. Professor Shi Erfu always had a straight face. He looked cold and heartless, but there were many people with a cold face who were warm-hearted. Professor Shi Erfu was very biased towards his own student, who was also the hero of the Golden Generation. Dake even thought that if Olivia Copernicus was confirmed to be the blood mistress, Professor Shi Erfu would even personally pick her up from Badia prison. But if it were him, maybe he would also. Professor Ka Zayer was relatively calm. In short, we can put the blood mistress matter aside for now. We should pay more attention to Luo Boat. We must ensure Luo Boat's safety. How about this? As he spoke, he looked at Dake. Dake, can you find a way to ask Luo Boat out? In a situation where it's not unexpected. Dake, Professor Ka Zayer, Are you worried that the vampire Vlad will become vigilant and parasitize someone else's body? Professor K. Zayer, soul parasitism isn't something that convenient. After every parasitic transfer, a part of the soul will be permanently lost. Repeated parasitism will continue to weaken. But even a rabbit will bite when it's anxious. We need to take precautions. Professor Shi Erfu said in a deep voice, if this is true, then it's actually our luck that he's only parasitizing Luo Boat's body. If he were to transfer to White's body, the consequences would be unimaginable. White was the son of the hero. Naturally, he had his own special abilities. Dake didn't ask for details. Instead he said, Luo Boat and White are always inseparable. It's very difficult to separate them. Shi Erfu, you can do it, right? Dake. Okay, I can. When Dake walked out of the office, he couldn't help but pat his head. A gust of wind drilled out of his brain, swirled around, and then drilled back into his head. We have to ask Luo Boat out without alerting the vampire. At the same time, we have to try our best to separate White and Luo Boat. We also have to do it in the middle of the night. The professors are asking for too much. I don't think they want to ask Luo Boat out. They want to ask the vampire out, right? But since even Professor K. Zayer can't sense it, there's nothing we can do. There's still a long way to go. Even though he accepted the mission, Dake wasn't in a hurry. Instead, he first went to the cafeteria to eat his fill, then returned to the dormitory to prepare. At this time, he already had an idea. At this time, in the library, White Gouda and Luo Boat Broheim were doing homework in the reading room. Although this morning's arithmetic class didn't give them a lot of homework, the two were still very troubled. Luo Boat couldn't continue writing. He moved a pile of newspapers over from the corner of the table and carefully flipped through them. These were the school newspapers he found in the library. He originally thought that Shang Malian Academy shouldn't have a school newspaper, but when he was looking for records related to Blood Mistress, he unexpectedly found this pile of newspapers. This made him very surprised. This meant that Shang Malian Academy at least had a school newspaper. Since this pile of school newspapers was likely to contain information about Hero and the others, White showed a very strong interest in it. But recently, his self-control had improved. He planned to finish his arithmetic homework first. Hey, Luo Boat, how can you read it first? Give me some. Luo Boat gave him half of the newspaper. The two didn't know where to start looking, so they just flipped through the newspaper from top to bottom. After flipping through the newspaper, they threw the homework to the back of their minds and began to whisper to each other. About half an hour later. Look at what I found. There's a group photo here. It looks like a competition. Isn't this Professor Claire? Luo Boat took out a newspaper and said excitedly. White quickly leaned over and asked, Where? Is there a photo of my father? There should be, right? Luo Boat said proudly. Let's look carefully. The two of them stared at the palm-sized photo for a while. But White couldn't find his father in it. He couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. Luo Boat quickly found the person he was looking for. Blood Mistress Ophelia Bullard. Luo Boat looked at it and couldn't help but mutter, The face looks the same. But doesn't she have dark red hair? Why is it black? White. Black hair? Let me take a look. 2-in-1 4,000 words. I'm finally done. Let's continue after dinner. Chapter 317. Caught in the middle of the crowd, Blood Mistress had her head lowered. She looked a little shy, and her shoulder-length black hair was extremely smooth. From the text, it was probably a group photo taken when they were in 3rd grade. Not only was Blood Mistress in it, but there were also Claire and Yvette. The reason why Hero Brett wasn't included wasn't because he lacked strength back then, but because this was a competition restricted to females. White was more sensitive to long black hair, so he looked at it very seriously. However, he couldn't tell much from this photo. Isn't Blood Mistress a descendant of the Blood Clan? Perhaps this black hair was her original hair color, but after she started practicing blood magic, her hair color changed? White stroked his chin as he speculated. However, his unintentional guess made Robert's face turn ghastly pale in an instant. Hair color could change. If practicing blood magic could really make one's hair turn red. No wonder he kept feeling that the blood mistress he saw in the fog had redder hair than the blood mistress in 300 Heroes. Luo Boat, are you all right? White noticed the abnormality and couldn't help but ask. Remember in a second. https://m. Vipkanchu. VIP Luo Boat quickly composed himself and said, "Of course I'm fine. Let's continue looking. Maybe we can find something new?" Just as the two were reading the school newspaper together, Panduola welcomed an uninvited guest at the front desk of the library. She narrowed her eyes and looked at the girl who appeared at the door. She couldn't help but frown. There were people coming and going in the library every day. Of course, she wouldn't remember everyone's appearance, but this girl gave her a very strange feeling of unfamiliarity. It seemed to be an inhuman aura. She couldn't help but feel a little wary. However, the person who appeared behind the girl made her let down her guard. Not long after, the girl went around the counter and entered the spacious reading room. She had short black hair, double eyelids, long eyelashes, and a cherry mouth. Her school uniform was slightly loose, but it made her look petite and cute. After entering the reading room, she walked carefully, her eyes darting left and right as if she was looking for something. After a long while, her eyes suddenly lit up and she walked straight towards White and Luo Boat. Newcomers always attract extra attention. The students who were reading homework couldn't help but raise their heads to take a look. Some people had already seen it. Some people looked at her curiously, wanting to see who she was looking for. When people thought she would pass by the table where White and Luo Boat were sitting, she suddenly stopped and stared at White in front of the table. White was startled by the light and couldn't help but raise her head to look at the girl's bright and spirited eyes. White, who had never been stared at by a petite and cute girl, suddenly felt a little flustered. Her heart started to beat faster. Luo Boat, who was reading the school newspaper, looked up a beat later and asked, "Who are you?" The girl seemed to be startled by him and subconsciously took half a step back. White complained, "Don't scare people. May I ask why you're looking for us?" But the girl didn't answer. She only pursed her lips and carefully looked at him. White was sure he was being observed, which made him very uncomfortable. However, very quickly, the girl suddenly raised the hand that she had hidden behind her back. Then, she abruptly leaned forward and stretched out her arm. In the palm of her hand was a box of chocolates. Looking at the box of chocolates and the girl biting her lips stubbornly and shyly, White was stunned. Luo Boat, who was next to him, also froze, as if he had been hit by a paralysis curse. For them, this was a scene that they could only see in their dreams. A very, very, very cute girl gave them, no, only White's chocolates. Although it was the day after Valentine's Day. But even if it was only a day later, it still counted, right? Ha ha ha. Luo Boat laughed dryly in his heart. White was so excited that his hands trembled. He couldn't help but ask, "Is it for me?" She was so careful that it was as if she was touching a dream. It was as if the dream would shatter if she spoke a little louder. The girl nodded slightly. White couldn't help but reach out and take the chocolates. Then the girl let go of her hand and suddenly bowed as if to thank him. Then, when White wanted to say something, she suddenly turned around and ran out of the reading room. She gave the impression of a very shy girl who finally decided to give the chocolates to the person she liked after Valentine's Day. After the chocolates were given, she ran away shyly. But who the hell is she? Luo Boat whispered after she ran away. But White didn't agree with him. Instead, he put the box of chocolates on the table, let go of his hand, and stared at it carefully. After a while he said, "Luo Boat, what do you think I should do?" Luo Boat joked, "She's pretty cute, isn't she?" White muttered, "But I already have someone in my heart." Luo Boat, "This involves an eternal problem." White, "What problem?" Luo Boat, "Between the person you love and the person who loves you, which one will you be happier with?" White, "If it were you, what would you choose?" Luo Boat, "Of course I'd choose the person who loves me." White, then he couldn't help but hesitate. It was only yesterday that he had been ignored. But now, he still couldn't make up his mind. Let me think. It took him half an hour to think about it. White hesitated, but in the end, he didn't open the box of chocolates in the library. When it got late, he left the library with Luo Boat. As usual, Panduola registered his departure, just like everyone else who came to the library. White gradually realized that giving her chocolates wouldn't attract her attention. Because she received too many chocolates on Valentine's Day. It wasn't that there weren't any other outstanding girls at the school, but Panduola was the librarian, so all the students at the school had access to her. So there were a lot of people who admired her. Amidst so many people, Werther didn't stand out at all. His identity as the hero's son didn't have much use. In contrast, there was another girl who had noticed him, and she personally gave him a box of chocolates. White thought a lot on the way from the library to his dorm. Finally, he made a decision. Hey, White, let's play around after you shower? Luo Boat waved at him in the hallway. He subconsciously said, "Of course, I'll wait for you." Then he unlocked his door and quickly sat down at his desk. He put his bag on the desk and took out the box of chocolates. After putting the box of chocolates on the desk, White took a deep breath, clapped his hands like he was on a pilgrimage, and began to open the box. Is this store-bought chocolates? The moment White saw the chocolates, he couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. He saw that the box of chocolates was homemade, so he thought that the chocolates inside were also handmade. Handmade chocolates weren't necessarily as delicious as store-bought chocolates, but it represented the intention. White valued this. Maybe she's a clumsy girl. White quickly found a reason for himself. Then he found a card in the box and couldn't help but sigh in relief. The worst thing was that he didn't know her name and school. That would be very difficult to find. But when he took out the card, he found that there was no name on it. If you think I can do it, please reply to me. Tonight at 11 o'clock, I'll wait for you here. A equals. At the end of the card was a small map. Although the map was simple, it was easy to recognize the location at a glance. It was the bridge where White opened into the abyss for the first time under the full moon. Because of its location, the bridge between the castles was often a place for couples to date, so some students called it Lover's Bridge. It was indeed a good place to meet up. But at 11 o'clock at night, White's heart was beating like a drum. Should I go or not? 11 o'clock at night, only an hour before the curfew, and there are magic statues patrolling. But if I don't go, will she keep waiting there? If I miss the curfew because of waiting there, won't it be my fault? Knock, knock, knock. Someone knocked on the door. White snapped back to reality. He quickly put away the card and went to open the door. Luo Boat, who had quickly taken a shower, walked in wearing plush pajamas and holding a magic chess set in his hand. White hesitated for a moment, but still decided to play chess with him. But at 10:30, he looked at Luo Boat, who wanted to play another game, and said hesitantly, "Luo Boat, I want to go to bed early tonight." Luo Boat froze for a moment. His eyes inadvertently glanced at the chocolate box on the desk, and then he simply said, "Of course, I'm a bit tired today." So he packed up the chessboard and quickly returned to his dorm. But after he put down the chessboard, he went to the door and opened it a little. Tonight, when Werther was playing chess, he had been absent-minded the whole time. It was obvious. Sure enough, it didn't take long before he heard footsteps from White's dorm. So it's starting? Luo Boat couldn't help but feel a little relieved. White finally gave up on the impossible Chan Yushan. He really thought that the girl who gave him the chocolate was pretty good. Her hair was black, which was White's favorite color. Even though her hair was short, it would grow out with time. Luo Boat thought as he opened the door and quietly followed White. Don't ask me why I followed her. Who doesn't like gossip? 3rd floor of the castle. Same old place. Dake leaned against the window and looked at the Lover's Bridge on the 2nd floor. He couldn't help but feel a little sorry. If he had any other choice, he wouldn't have come up with this plan. But in this situation, There weren't many ways to lure Luo Boat out without him being vigilant. Also, he had to make sure that Luo Boat and White were separated by a certain distance in the middle of the night, which was a dangerous time. Everything is to check if there's a vampire in Luo Boat's body. Presumably, White will understand when she finds out. Dake was a little embarrassed as he flipped the magic card in his hand. Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat. Here it comes. For tonight's operation, Professor Ka Zayer specially adjusted the patrol route of the golems. White successfully avoided all the golems and arrived at Lover's Bridge before 11 o'clock. As soon as he arrived at the bridge, the cold wind blew over. He couldn't help but grab his collar and pull it together. Then, as if he had made up his mind, he walked to the other side of the bridge. It was almost time. If the girl was already here, she should be on the other side of the bridge. When he crossed the bridge, someone quietly peeked out half of his head from the direction he came from. It was Luo Boat who followed him. Luo Boat was very familiar with White. So when he followed him, he always kept a distance from White. He didn't use his eyes to look behind him. He only followed him by listening. He was very satisfied with his performance tonight. He really wanted to praise himself as a stalker master. I hope they'll be successful. Luo Boat couldn't help but wish him well. He turned around and didn't go any further. When White reached the other side of the bridge, he finally saw the girl. The girl was wearing a school uniform and stood there quietly, like a petite jasmine flower. White suppressed the excitement in his heart, but he couldn't help but speed up. When White was in front of the girl, he took the initiative to say, "Good evening, I still don't know your name." Busy. For the first time, the girl spoke in front of a boy. White asked, "What?" Then he said, "Mang Mang? You're called Mang Mang?" Girl, busy. White, in short, it's Mang Mang. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to receive your chocolate tonight. Just as White was whispering, the girl's head suddenly began to melt. From the top of her head, it melted down like a candle. The originally delicate facial features and cute face. White was stunned for a moment. Then his whole body trembled from the terrifying scene, and he let out a piercing scream from his throat. The sound disappeared. It was the familiar silence card. Has it started? Dake picked up the Monster of Variety magic card in his hand and felt the changes of the monster. He gradually knew what was going on. He listened attentively. Something was slowly approaching from all directions, and there were many of them. Everything was under control. And on the second floor of the castle under his feet, at the end of Lover's Bridge, Luo Boat Broheim was leaning against the wall, thinking. Suddenly, he saw a golem coming over. He was shocked and quickly curled up in a corner. 2 in 1 4,000. Today's update is 8,400. Chapter 318. Luo Boat had managed to avoid a large number of golems on the way from the Knights Institute Tower to Lover's Bridge, greatly lowering his guard against them. Although he had the bitter experience of being chased by a golem, if everyone could learn from their mistakes, then the world would be full of smart people. Moonlight shone in from the outside, sandwiching the walls on both sides of the corner, forming a triangular shadow. Luo Boat looked at the approaching golem and hurriedly held his breath, doing his best to curl up his body into the shadows. But of course, this kind of deceiving oneself would not succeed. The golem model was called Light Cavalry. It was about 2 meters tall and half a meter wide. It was covered in light armor. Its lower body was mainly made of rollers, but it also had spider legs. Light Cavalry moved relatively fast, and its spider legs were sticky, allowing it to stick to the walls of the castle. This meant that it could truly leap over roofs and vault over walls. Light Cavalry mainly used dual swords as weapons, and the Light Cavalry in front of him was the same. The axis of its waist was a disc that could rotate 360 degrees, and it was best at killing by unfolding its dual swords and rotating its waist to form a blade storm. Unlike the Heavy Cavalry, that had a paralysis gem on its forehead, the Light Cavalry did not have any long-range magic skills. It would usually use its spider legs to suppress its enemies, making them surrender but not kill them. Website: https://m Vipkanchu. VIP, don't kill creatures other than the magic guiding sprite, was an iron rule engraved in the core of all golems. Therefore, the students did not have to worry about being killed by the golems. What they had to worry about was being caught by the golems and being punished by the school rules and confinement. Luo Boat did not want to be confined. But while he was trembling, the golem did not change its direction at all and walked straight towards him. And it was gradually accelerating, faster and faster. By the time Luo Boat realized that something was wrong, the golem had already pulled out its dual swords and swept towards him like the wind. Fuck! Luo Boat's face suddenly revealed a frightened expression. Then he suddenly threw himself outside, covering his head and fleeing like a rat. At this time, of course, he could no longer care about whether or not White had discovered him. Although the golems could theoretically stop when necessary, no one would really leave their life in the hands of the golem's internal circuits when the blade was pointed at them. Who knew if this ancient golem would break at a critical moment? With his path blocked, Luo Boat could only run towards Lover's Bridge. But as soon as he got on the bridge, he suddenly realized, why did this scene seem so familiar? Fuck. The last time I was caught was also here. Robert jerked his head up and looked at the other end of the bridge. Last time, it was precisely because two golems had occupied the two ends of the bridge and surrounded them on the bridge that they had no way to escape. This time, would a golem on the other side, Thovs? That can't. White. S's. He white he's he. S's panic. Luo Boat did not realize how strange it was that not a single sound was. In this critical moment, he took out a magic card from the card bag he carried with him and quickly recited the usual summoning spell. As the magic card lit up with a white light, an ugly rat man, who was as tall as a human, appeared behind him. This magic elf named Ratman Cyborg had a simple mechanical structure on its left and a rotten body on its right. It carried a box full of acid on its back and a huge acid ejector in its hands. Card name, Ratman Cyborg. Type, Elf card. Level, Yen, Race, Machine. Attribute, Steel. Magic power, 900 Attack, 900 Defense, 800 Ultimate skill, Acid ejector. Under its master's command, the ferocious Ratman Cyborg lifted its acid ejector and sprayed it at the light cavalry that was chasing from the front. However, when the highly corrosive acid hit the light cavalry, it just slid off like water and didn't cause any damage. The difference in level between the two was too great. Luo Boat did not need to turn his head to know that this would be the result. In fact, he had already verified it the last time in this same place. At that time, his Ratman Cyborg could not even last one round. In a very short period of time, the light cavalry used the rotational force of its waist to open its abdomen with two swords and instantly cut it in half. It was a coincidence. This time, the Ratman Cyborg was repeating history. Looking at the Ratman Cyborg that was cut in half and turned into a beam of light that quickly returned to the magic card, Robert was neither sad nor happy. There was only fear. The amount of time that the Ratman Cyborg had bought was shorter than he had expected. And if he wanted to summon the next magic card, he would have to wait for the cooldown to end. White. In his anxiety, Luo Boat shouted in a panic. This was both a request for help and a reminder. He did not know if White was indulging in his woman and did not notice the movement here, but he had to make him react. Whether it was support or escape, it would depend on White himself. But there was still no sound from the other end of the bridge. Could it be that White has been caught in such a short period of time? This thought appeared in an instant. Luo Boat's brain almost stopped working. Could it be that he encountered the dragon cavalry? Despair invaded his mind. At the window on the third floor, Dake looked down at Luo Boat on the bridge. Until now, he was not sure if Luo Boat was possessed by a vampire. In theory, what he did tonight was very likely to be useless. But if he could rule out this possibility, the possibility of the other option would be greatly increased. After that, he would have to look for the blood mistress. In short, he had to eat one bite at a time, and investigation had to be done step by step. At this time, he just needed to quietly watch the show. The thing that Luo Boat was most afraid of did not happen. After the light cavalry statue killed the Ratman cyborg, it did not immediately catch up to him. He successfully ran to the other end of the bridge. And he did not find any golems squatting at this end. Yes. Although White Gouda and his girl were not here for some reason. But this side was safe. Whoosh! Luo Boat, who was about to rejoice, subconsciously turned his head to see where the light cavalry had gone. But when he turned his head, he was almost scared out of his wits. He saw that at least a dozen golems were gathering at the end of the passage where the light cavalry was located. Could it be that I poked a hornet's nest? Looking at those magical golems of different shapes and sizes, Robert really wanted to bang his head against the wall and end it all. Among the golems, there was not only the agile light cavalry, but also the defense-specialized heavy cavalry, as well as a small golem used for reconnaissance, beetle. The beetle golem was less than half a meter tall. It was petite, and its main body was a disc like a cleaning robot. From the middle of the disc, there was a retractable structure that acted as the neck. At the top of the neck, there was a round head with two protruding compound eyes on the head. In addition to increasing the range of vision, the two compound eyes could also record images. The gem between the eyebrows was used for alarms and summoning companions. As long as it detected the target, the beetle golem would make a "biu-biu-biu" alarm sound and summon nearby golems. Below the beetle disc, there were 4 rotatable wheels and small spider legs that were usually stored in the disc. Although those spider legs could not support it to stick to the wall, they could be used to cross most complex terrains. As long as the beetle targeted it, it would be very difficult to escape. But in fact, there were not many small golems, beetles. Most of them were placed near the entrance of the secret passage. Although the beetle had aroused Luo Boat's vigilance, what really scared him was the Dragon Knight mixed in with the golems. The Dragon Knight wielding a great sword was like a god of war, exuding an aura of despair. Scared to death, Luo Boat did not dare to stay any longer. He madly ran forward. His running speed was fast enough that the golems behind him could not catch up to him. At least that was what he believed. Luo Boat ran wildly. Thanks to his previous experiences, he was quite familiar with the terrain here. Relying on his excellent physical strength, he actually managed to shake off the golems behind him. Seeing that the golems behind him were gradually disappearing, he suddenly squeezed into a corner and leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. Only then did he suddenly remember, so, where did White go? While thinking, he suddenly raised his head. The tall walls of the castle were reflected in his eyes as if they went straight to his brain. The entire passage was extremely spacious and silent. The deep chill of the night seeped into his bones. Luo Boat's mind calmed down, but he also suddenly felt the loneliness and fear of being alone in this huge castle. But at this time, he finally displayed the courage of a student of the Night Academy. Summoning the courage to face his fear, Luo Boat slowly stood up straight with the support of the wall. So, what should I do next? Should I go find White, or return to the tower? But just as he stood up straight, he suddenly noticed a dark shadow hanging down from the side. The frequently flickering red light shone in his eyes. A beetle appeared at the corner without a sound. Biu-biu-biu, the alarm of the beetle, suddenly sounded and almost immediately spread everywhere. Then Luo Boat directly heard the rustling sound of something rolling from all around him. Those golems were coming again. Luo Boat had no choice but to run again. Then he fell into an endless cycle of fleeing, and fleeing again. And behind him, after the wave of golems, White, who was almost scared to death by the polymorphic monster, was submissive and didn't dare to complain. Because the person next to him was Professor Shi Erfu. Professor Sarah Shi Erfu walked behind the golems with a serious face. A light green wind constantly blew from the front, swirling around her ears and the corners of her eyes. Although they were far away, Luo Boat and the surrounding situation were always under her control. White wanted to ask what she was doing, but seeing how focused Professor Shi Erfu was, he didn't dare to disturb her. Half an hour later, he finally couldn't help but ask, "Professor, the person those golems are chasing, is Luo Boat? Professor Shi Erfu didn't refuse to answer as he expected. Yes, it's Luo Boat. White mustered up his courage and asked, why? At this time, he had roughly guessed that the purpose of the girl drawing him out wasn't for him, but to indirectly fish out Luo Boat. But what was the value of fishing out Luo Boat? Although White knew it wasn't right to think this way, at that moment, he really thought so. Professor Shi Erfu glanced at him and said indifferently, we suspect that the vampire Vlad is parasitizing Luo Boat's body. They didn't tell White about this at first because they were afraid that he wouldn't be able to disguise himself well and accidentally leak it. But now that the plan had begun, there was no harm in telling him. The vampire Vlad. Impossible, how could he be hiding in Luo Boat's body? White wanted to deny it at first, but after thinking carefully, he suddenly became speechless. Since Christmas, Luo Boat had indeed shown some abnormalities. Perhaps others couldn't sense it. But he and Luo Boat had always been inseparable, so he was most aware of the changes in Luo Boat. Now that he thought about it, some knowledge that should have been obscure could always come out of Luo Boat's mouth. Luo Boat, who had no other strong points except for his physical strength, actually had a gift for divination. Luo Boat, who had a headache when he saw words, was now able to calm down and read books. Even the time he spent playing magic chess with Luo Boat was limited. No matter how one looked at it, the current Luo Boat was a completely different person from the past. White couldn't help but murmur, so, Dake suddenly used Vlad's chess pieces to play magic chess some time ago because of this? Professor Shi Erfu. No, that's another matter. There's another matter? White didn't know why, but he suddenly felt like a newborn baby who didn't know anything. Professor Shi Erfu didn't mention the other matter. Instead, he asked, you don't seem to be too surprised that there's a vampire hiding in Luo Boat's body? White scratched his head. I think there's a trace. Professor Shi Erfu. Is that so? Then it seems that we might have a harvest tonight. After a while, Professor Shi Erfu suddenly raised his eyebrows and said, Ka-Zayer, are you sure? On the third floor of the castle, Professor Ka-Zayer, who was following Luo Boat from above, had his eyes shining. Dake, who was following him, couldn't help but be excited. Professor, did you sense it? Professor Ka-Zayer smiled. Yes, just now, a trace of blood leaked out from Luo Boat's position. There's no mistake, it's a vampire. 2 in 1. The rumor of exploding subscriptions is actually true. Hungry. Chapter 319. Everything was going according to plan. Dake and the two professors had watched the entire process from the moment the polymorph transformed into a chocolate delivery monster. If there was a mistake in any part of the plan, they would find a way to make up for it. But in fact, the plan went a lot smoother than expected. Dake had a thorough understanding of White and Luo Boat's personality and behavior patterns. He had predicted almost all of their reactions. That was why the current scene was happening. Professor Ka-Zayer had adjusted the behavior patterns of the golems along the route, making them cooperate with Luo Boat to play the game of cat and mouse. The goal was to make Luo Boat feel threatened again and again. This would make the vampire's soul inside his body react. The soul and the body were bound together for good or ill. Since there were no other parasites around him, Vlad's soul would definitely disperse if Robert died. Remember the URL. Vipkanchu. VIP therefore, as long as Luo Boat was in danger and he felt that it wasn't a deliberate trap, there would be a chance to lure the vampire out. As long as he exposed a trace of his presence, Professor Ka-Zayer would be able to rely on his extremely strong mental power to detect and confirm his existence. The flaw in this plan was that last night's astronomy class had already alerted the enemy. Therefore, Vlad's vigilance was likely to be higher than usual, making it harder to trick him. Fortunately, Dake's method was indeed perfect. Even Luo Boat himself would only think that all his actions were his own subjective decisions. And Vlad's shrewdness didn't seem to be as deep as imagined? That was the truth. Because Vlad had escaped Professor Ka-Zayer's detection, Professor Ka Zayer and Professor Shi Erfu had always treated him as a wise and far-sighted person. However, Vlad was actually an arrogant vampire who had lost most of his memories. If he hadn't been beaten up by Dake in the secret passage, he wouldn't even know how to restrain himself. But even so, after parasitizing Luo Boat's body, it exposed some small flaws. A few minutes ago, Luo Boat, who had been running for a long time, was finally pushed to his limit. The physical strength that he was proud of was gradually depleting. He could already feel that his legs were weak and his abdomen was in pain. During this process, the magic cards that he had accumulated over a long period of time were almost used up, but he was still unable to completely shake off the magic statue's search. The only thing that comforted him was that he had not seen White even after running for so long on the second floor of the castle. This made him feel that White must have been lucky enough to avoid the tide of golems. Perhaps she had already returned to the dormitory before the curfew. That's right. It was already past 12. It was time for the curfew. He could no longer return to the dormitory. Luo Boat's despair deepened at the thought of having to spend the night outdoors in such a cold night. It seemed that when White wasn't around, his luck wasn't very good. Last time, when he went out to chase after White, he was met with an unexpected disaster and slept outside for a night. Although he hadn't been caught this time, the outcome of sleeping outside seemed to be doomed. These two things together fully explained that tailing was not a good idea. In the blink of an eye, he once again came to a familiar corner, and then drifted around the corner. Bang! Almost without warning, he kicked a beetle, and the whole body tilted forward as a result. Seeing that he was about to fall to the ground, Luo Boat grabbed the beetle's long neck at the critical moment and barely supported his body. But as the beetle's neck gradually bent, he had to use his other hand to support his body on the ground and tried to slow his fall as much as possible. At least he didn't fall too hard. However, with this delay, the beetle immediately issued a hurried alarm, and the red gem between its eyebrows flashed wildly. Not only the golems chasing from behind, but even the patrolling golems in front of him also moved after receiving the call. Luo Boat relied on the roll to reduce the force. After getting up, he hurriedly fled forward. But just as he started to move, he heard the sound of wheels moving closer and closer. This caused his expression to change in an instant. Surrounded. He didn't have time to think. A light cavalry, chasing from behind, had already rushed around the corner, and the long sword in its right hand chopped down without a trace of delay. Hiss! Luo Boat's robe was instantly torn open by the sword. But he didn't have time to feel distressed, and he continued to rush forward in panic. However, after a few steps, a black shadow flashed across the road ahead. Another light cavalry had blocked the road ahead. There was a wolf in front and a tiger behind. Luo Boat's heart instantly fell to the bottom. Under the pressure of the light cavalry in front of him, Luo Boat suddenly stopped, and then subconsciously put his hand into his card bag. But after the magic flowing at his fingertips brushed across the side of the magic card, he only received a message that made him feel despair. Whoosh! In an instant, the sound of a long sword piercing through the air was heard. Luo Boat's face suddenly changed. He couldn't judge from which angle the long sword was coming from behind, so he could only use all his strength to throw himself to the side. This throw allowed him to successfully avoid the attack of the light cavalry behind him. However, after his body fell, he lost his balance. He wanted to stand up again, but his limbs were weak. For a moment, he could only stick to the wall, looking at the two light cavalry gradually approaching him with a face full of horror. The approaching light cavalry was in front of him in 2 steps. He saw it raise the sword in its left hand, suddenly lean forward, and with the strength of its left arm, the long sword pierced through his head and nailed him to the wall. Ah! There was a delay of half a second. Luo Boat screamed in horror. Then, the light cavalry maintained its posture of leaning forward, its 2 spider legs raised high, and the sharp tips of its feet fiercely pierced the sides of his neck. It formed a triangle with the long sword, locking Luo Boat's head in the middle. Luo Boat suddenly panicked and didn't know what to do. His whole body trembled, and he didn't dare to move. He raised his head slightly, and stared firmly into the eyes of the light cavalry, as if he was afraid that a beam of light would burst out from those mechanical eyes. On the other side, the light cavalry, blocking the road in front of him, also walked over. It actually stopped at his side, and then raised the long sword in its right hand over its head, and looked as if it was about to chop down his head. At that moment, inside Luo Boat's body, the vampire Vlad finally couldn't help but leak a trace of his aura. A layer of blood-red light flashed through Luo Boat's eyes in an instant. In a situation where he himself didn't know what was going on, his right hand actually reached into the card bag again. Then, with a flip of his fingers and the flow of magic power, a small magic array emerged inside the card bag. As the magic array lit up, a hidden compartment appeared inside the card bag. It wasn't until his fingers reached in and touched the cold card in the compartment that Luo Boat suddenly woke up. Where did this magic card come from? There was no time to think. Luo Boat quickly injected magic power, and chanted the usual summoning spell. To him, this magic card was like a treasure chest that had fallen from the heavens. It was a timely help. No matter what, he had to use it. In the name of Vlad, magic summoning. Vlad. While Luo Boat was frightened and puzzled, the red light in his eyes became more and more intense. His body was no longer under his control. He raised his right hand, and the magic card hidden in the hidden compartment was drawn out. Then, the dark red magic card was raised high. A glaring blood-red light flashed. A giant bat with scarlet eyes suddenly flew out from it, and the blood-red halo that erupted in an instant produced a powerful thrust, pushing away the light cavalry in front of Luo Boat and the other light cavalry on the side. The liberated Luo Boat wanted to lift his feet and escape, but he was shocked to find that both his hands and feet were out of his control. At this moment, the panic that was more intense than when he was suppressed by the light cavalry was infinitely magnified in his brain. He found that he had already become a marionette, and from the spell that he blurted out, the one who lifted him up was actually that terrifying vampire, Vlad. Vlad the Vampire. Chess piece, fog, divination, bloody concubine. Even Luo Boat finally connected some clues at this moment, and combined them together to form his own judgment. Although this judgment wasn't completely correct, his understanding of the situation at this moment was completely correct. I've been possessed by Vlad? At the moment when his body was being manipulated, Luo Boat couldn't express the fear and anxiety in his heart through any part of his body other than his expression. His face twitched and twisted. Suddenly, he saw that the giant bat, after pushing the light cavalry away, turned around and faced him with a mouse-like face full of coarse hair and scarlet eyes. Then, the giant bat actually counterattacked. Under his fearful and helpless gaze, he bit down on his neck. The cold feeling of blood loss spread throughout his body. Luo Boat screamed crazily in his heart. But his voice couldn't be heard. And after the bat sucked a big mouthful of blood, it actually stopped. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Luo Boat had a feeling that the bat seemed to be looking at him and communicating with his eyes. But he didn't understand it at all. He only saw blood slowly dripping from the bat's fangs in its huge open mouth. It was his blood. Squeak. The bat suddenly let out a scream. Then it abruptly turned around and rushed toward one of the light cavalry. He saw that the light cavalry had already regrouped. It raised both its swords and stabbed at the wings of the bat like the wind. Although the bat was fierce, but its wings were still weak and were directly pierced by the swords. If it was before, Luo Boat couldn't wait for the light cavalry to be defeated on the spot. But at this moment, he only wanted to see the bat be cut in half. But things didn't always go as one wished. The giant bat, whose wings were pierced, didn't hesitate to close in. Suddenly, a strong bloody light erupted from its body, illuminating the entire passage. Boom! There was a loud noise. That giant bat, after absorbing Luo Boat's blood, chose to self-destruct. This explosion was earth-shattering. The light armor of the light cavalry was actually blown to pieces. When the explosion subsided, a pitch-black hole had been blasted open in its chest. It was completely scrapped. Just when Luo Boat thought that the giant bat had also completely disappeared with this explosion. Blood was gradually condensing in the air. Then, Small bats condensed from blood were born one after another. More than 10 small bats were flying in the air in groups. The remaining light cavalry followed the guidance of the internal circuit and abandoned Luo boat, who was gradually standing up. It raised its swords and rushed toward the bats. Luo boat could clearly hear his own breathing. He suddenly regained some feeling in his hands and feet. It seemed that the vampire Vlad's manipulation of him was only temporary. But when he stood up with difficulty, he suddenly felt a huge impact in his head. Then, his whole body froze in place like a wooden puppet. He lost consciousness. And the vampire Vlad had completely taken over his body. Damn trash. Vlad opened his eyes. His pupils were suffused with the color of blood. He stretched his limbs, which he hadn't stretched in a long time, but what he felt was the soreness and weakness in his limbs. Choosing Luo boat as the host was a last-minute decision he made after his self-confidence was thwarted. Although what really attracted him was actually White's body. However, he was very clear that such a special talent would definitely be watched by many people. If there were too many people watching, it would be easy to reveal flaws. So he finally chose the most inconspicuous person besides Dake who was present at the time, Luo boat Broheim. He chose to live in a human body instead of finding a bat to be reborn. Apart from escaping and hiding, the biggest reason was that he understood the development of civilization and the changes of time during the battle with Dake and the others. In other words, he knew that he was outdated. So he wanted to learn the knowledge of the new era, accumulate new knowledge, and become strong again. Only in this way could the glory of the vampires shine on the earth. But after he parasitized Luo boat's body, he encountered unexpected difficulties. Because Luo boat didn't like to study. He couldn't even come into contact with books outside of textbooks. Helpless, he could only do some small actions. He let Luo boat feel the joy of learning by answering questions correctly in class. Little by little, he guided Luo boat to become a good student who actively obtained knowledge. For this, Vlad put in unimaginable effort. The final result was barely satisfactory. But in this month, Vlad still grasped some of the necessary knowledge for a first year. He even took advantage of when Luo boat was asleep to successfully refine a few magic cards and hid them in the interlayer of his card bag. If he continued like this, although it wouldn't be too smooth, he would always be able to grasp more knowledge and gradually improve his magic engineering skills. There was an innate barrier between magic engineering and magic technology. The basic theory between the two contradicted each other. The more advanced a mage was, the more difficult it was to grasp magic engineering. But Vlad had already forgotten most of his memories. This instead became an advantage for him to receive a magic engineering education. He was very fascinated by magic engineering and wanted to learn more. However, the recent series of anomalies had left Vlad feeling that something was amiss. Especially yesterday's astronomy class and tonight's night. The sharp intuition that originated from the vampire bloodline made Vlad realize that he might have walked to the edge of the cliff where he would be exposed. He was already considering whether to give up Luo boat's body and transfer into someone else's body at the cost of losing part of his soul to avoid detection. But after this idea came into his mind, he suddenly realized that his soul seemed to be incomplete to begin with. If he continued to split it, he might very well face the danger of collapse. At most, he would have to transfer again. Therefore, this time he had to be very, very careful. Vlad observed for a long time. His target was the students of the House of Fools. The students of the House of Fools were low-key and inconspicuous. Even if he accidentally revealed a little of his own excellence in the future, it could be said that he had been well prepared. Look. This was so suitable for his identity. But before he had time to take action, tonight's encounter happened. The group of golems gave him the illusion that they were chasing and intercepting, as if someone was deliberately forcing him into a trap. He was aware of this. So at first, he hid very well. Even Professor Ka Zayer didn't sense his existence at all. Unfortunately, when it came to the end, he couldn't hide it. The moment Vlad summoned the bloodbat, he had a premonition that he was very likely to be exposed. His premonition was correct. But the results seemed to be better than he imagined. Looking at the blond boy who walked out from the group of golems, Vlad couldn't help but sneer. So, you planned all of this? Yes, it was me. Dake folded his hands and answered very calmly. All the golems stopped moving after he appeared. Vlad's mouth curved into a smile, but his eyes were still gloomy. At first, he thought this was the plan of the Shang-Molian Academy's professors. Those unfathomable professors were what he was most afraid of. But if it wasn't the professors who planned this, but the blonde boy in front of him, he would still be a little afraid, but not desperate. Do you think the current me is still the same as before? Vlad opened his mouth and lowered his voice in a Luo boat voice. Dake was a little startled, but then he couldn't help but laugh. No way. You don't think the current me is still the same as before, do you? Both of them looked at each other. Vlad suddenly burst out laughing and took a step back. The dozen or so bloodbats, that were born from the self-destruction of the bloodbat, quickly gathered, one by one. They bared their sharp fangs and rushed forward. Dake glanced at those bloodbats, and judged that they should be only one-star magic elves. So, he moved his fingertips, and the magic card hidden in his hand quickly lit up. Hawkman Wrestling. Hatcha. The Hawkman Wrestling that rushed to join the battle showed its boiling fighting spirit. Its eyes narrowed, and it pounced on those blood-bats. Feather Dance. Following Dake's order, the Hawkman Wrestling used the midline of its body as the axis and spun rapidly in the air. Countless feathers shot out from its wings and pierced those ferocious bats. A few bats were pierced by the feathers and exploded in an instant, leaving only a drop of blood behind. That was Luo Boat's blood. A few other bats suddenly turned into light and merged with the bloodlight that shot from Vlad's direction, forming a terrifying summoning array that emitted a bloody aura. Sacrificial summoning. Dake's pupils shrank. Vlad had learned the sacrificial summoning. His magic card was refined by controlling Luo Boat. In a short moment of thinking, a ferocious-looking blood fiend rushed out from the sacrificial summoning array. The blood fiend was 2 meters tall, and its whole body was as red as flowing blood. Its overall appearance was like a tiger or leopard, and there was a tentacle with a long mouth on each side of its shoulders. The long tail behind its buttocks was like a huge snake waving in the air. Judging from the number of sacrificed bats, this blood fiend was at least 5-star. 5-star magic fairy. Even Dake had not refined half a blood fiend. How did Vlad, with his Luo Boat body, manage to refine it? Dake was surprised. But in reality, he was not flustered. When the blood fiend pounced, a white shadow suddenly jumped down from the sky. After landing on the ground, it took a few steps and suddenly jumped up. Accompanied by a sharp cat's cry, a cat's claw tore the blood fiend's face apart, and at the same time, it twisted and broke one of its tentacles. Roar! The blood fiend instantly let out a miserable cry. The stinky blood spurted out from the wound and splashed onto the Dilu beast's body. The somewhat misophobic Dilu beast furrowed its brows and fiercely glared at the screaming blood fiend. As the Dilu beast's eyes widened, a ray of light shot out from the amber cat's eyes like a spinning wheel, shooting into the blood fiend's eyes. The blood fiend, which had just been summoned and had not had time to swing its tail, felt dizzy. Under the influence of the cat's eyes, it fell into extreme confusion. If that's the only thing, Dake looked at Vlad curiously. Why didn't he cooperate with the blood fiend to attack? Even if he was only a parasite in Luo Boat's body, he was now able to control Luo Boat's body. It couldn't be because he didn't have enough magic power, right? Luo Boat's magic power limit was indeed not high. It was far from enough to support Vlad to release that kind of red magic light in the secret passage. Without magic power, the vampire Vlad could not do anything with Luo Boat's physical strength. But if he did not use magic and did not attack at close range, if he only relied on magic power, he would be a professional. But Vlad's laughter did not stop. After he sacrificed the blood fiend to summon it, he had already taken out the third magic card from the card pack. This was the result of his hard work for more than a month. The gathered blood will eventually become a sea of blood that gives birth to life. King of the night shrouded in darkness, awaken, vampire count. He slashed his left hand and let the blood drip down. Then, he raised the magic card with his right hand. His expression gradually became crazed. The blood fiends that had fallen into a state of chaos actually exploded as he chanted. Bright red blood flowed all over the ground. It fused with the blood dripping from the bat. It reformed in the ancient castle. With the blood as the guide. The secret ritual card that was refined with Vlad's soul as the core shone in the air. The vampire that had split into countless clones and allowed Vlad to be reborn in the secret passage. The 8-star magic fairy that was once the hidden boss of the 8th floor during the Halloween event. The vampire count had finally reappeared in this world. This was the source of Vlad's confidence. Dake looked at the vampire count that Vlad had summoned. It looked somewhat similar to the vampire beast, and immediately recalled the scene during the Halloween event. It wasn't until this moment that he finally had a few guesses about Vlad's origins. For this reason, he could not help but ask, "Vlad, is this the reason why you were reborn?" After successfully summoning the vampire count, the arrogance and confidence between Vlad's brows had resurfaced. He looked at Dake without the slightest bit of worry and sneered, "What is the truth of this matter? How can a human with their shallow intelligence understand it?" "Dake, you mean you don't know either?" A trace of anger flashed through Vlad's eyes. "Die, you mongrel cultivator! Blood is power!" The vampire count roared in response. The crimson cloak that was condensed from the blood on its body fluttered even though there was no wind, and its entire body floated into the air. Boiling blood gushed out from its open hands, continuously rushing to its feet and head, gradually condensing into 2 tumbling seas of blood. One after another, ferocious and terrifying blood fiends poked their heads out of the tumbling seas of blood. They tore at each other and roared angrily. Their roars resounded throughout the castle. Dake had seen this scene during the Halloween event. The vampire count in front of him was a summoner-type character, and its main method of fighting was to summon endless blood fiends from the Sea of Blood. As for itself, other than being able to borrow the power of the Sea of Blood to revive infinitely, it did not display any offensive or defensive abilities that matched an 8-star. Perhaps it did not possess such abilities. Or perhaps it did not display them. After all, it was a one-time summon boss, so it was possible that its strength was limited by shackles. However, the scale of the Sea of Blood of this vampire count was far inferior to the hidden boss from before. This was probably related to the fact that there was no blood altar under its feet. Dake narrowed his eyes slightly, and his fingers that were hidden in his sleeves picked up the second magic card, Fusion. At that moment, a black cat quickly ran over and met up with a Diru beast that was stained with blood and had a painful expression on its face. It was the Diru beast that Dake had already summoned and evolved before he appeared. The battle with the vampire Vlad had not been a careless one. Dake had already made precise calculations. As a large amount of magic power was injected into Fusion, the black and white fish on the card shook their tails and swam out of the card. They drilled out of his sleeves and grew with the wind. Sensing the call of Fusion, the Diru beast and the Diru beast raised their heads at the same time. After the black and white fish grew to more than 2 meters long, they flew toward the 2 magic elves that represented darkness and light respectively. The black fish circled around the Diru beast, while the white fish stuck to the Diru beast's body. The 2 magic elves turned into black and white light under the circling of the black and white fish, and they converged together like a spiral. A huge and mysterious magic array suddenly unfolded in the air. Then, the magic elven that was based on the Egyptian cat god once again danced out of the magic array. Moving cat ears, 2 cat tails that people could not help but want to grab. Coupled with soft orange hair, a delicate face, a slender waist like a cat, and a soft and beautiful body. It was like a walking book that people could not help but be intoxicated by. Coupled with pearls, gems, and golden rings all over its body, it was as if it was full of wealth. Money and wealth, women and beauty. A magic elven that gathered 2 fatal factors. This was the Basti Beast, the cat goddess. A 7-star Basti Beast and an 8-star vampire count. Who is the king that controls blood? The corner of Dake's mouth curled up, and his eyes were filled with anticipation. However, he still hid Paradise as his last resort. The origin of the Basti Beast was the little demon beast and the Diru beast. After they fused and evolved, they still belonged to Paradise, but after the two merged, they could only be counted as one entity. Therefore, if Paradise was activated, the magic attack and defense of the Basti beast would instantly increase by 900. In this form, the Basti beast could even fight a 9-star magic elven, let alone a mere 8-star magic elven. But if he did that directly, wouldn't it make Vlad feel despair? That wouldn't do. No matter what, he had to show that they were evenly matched. Basti beast, I'll leave the rest to you. It shouldn't be a problem, right? Dake looked at the sensitive back of the Basti beast and said slowly, Mia? The Basti beast turned its head and winked at him. Then, it walked forward with its cat-like steps. At that moment, Vlad's expression had changed slightly, but the vampire count was still roaring. When the sea of blood formed, a large group of blood fiends immediately leaped out, roaring crazily as they charged toward the Basti beast. Every blood fiend was more ferocious than the 5-star blood fiends from before. They seemed to be endless as they pounced out of the sea of blood, forming a terrifying blood tide. However, after the Basti beast walked to a certain distance, it gently stopped and stretched out its hand. The blood fiend that was leading the charge instantly lost its form when it came into contact with its fingertip, turning into the most primordial blood. The corner of the Basti beast's mouth curled up, and she softly chanted, "Vampires dance." The blood clump floating on her fingertip was instantly absorbed by her and turned into a purer power of darkness. The blood fiends that pounced over were ferocious and terrifying. But in front of the cat goddess, they were just rations that could be sucked at will. The Basti beast chuckled, and a bloody light flickered in her charming eyes. She actually went against the flow of the blood fiends and walked leisurely. The blood fiends that passed by her naturally turned into blood. Like the streamers of dancers, they were sucked to her and slowly flowed around her. It was especially gorgeous. 4-in-1 8,000 plus. I don't remember how many days I've updated a day this month. In short, give me some free tickets and things like that. In the reality of the plummeting subscriptions, give me some motivation to keep on updating. Chapter 320. Vampires Dance. While dancing, it approaches the opponent and sucks away every drop of blood in the opponent's body. The more beautiful the dance, the more deadly it was. The Basti beast's control over blood was obviously stronger than the vampire count's. And it wasn't just a little bit stronger. What was the reason for this? Although Dake had some guesses, he couldn't be sure. But in any case, the strong was the strong, and the weak was the weak. The Basti beast danced gracefully in the midst of the blood tide. Even Vlad couldn't help but be moved by its gorgeous movements. Vlad had parasitized Luo Boat's body and had seen the Basti beast's elegance in the newcomer competition. But that time, the Basti beast had only appeared briefly, and the competition had ended without even using a sure kill skill. But this time, he felt the natural charm of the opposite sex at close range, and his whole body became slightly hot. The Basti beast seemed to have an unusual attraction to vampires. Remember, https://m Vipkanchu. VIP Vlad quietly swallowed a mouthful of saliva, so that he wouldn't show any embarrassment in this duel. For this reason, he raised his spirits and coldly said to the vampire count, "Bloom, blood flower. Feel death." The vampire count roared in response. He suddenly stretched out his right arm, and his pale fingers with sharp nails pinched hard. Bang! A blood fiend that was close to the Basti beast and was about to turn into blood suddenly exploded. The blood flower petals that exploded from the inside out were enchanting and dazzling. Then, bang, bang, bang. Countless blood fiends that were rushing toward the Basti beast exploded one after another. The entire passage was like a flower bed where blood flowers bloomed, and the smell of blood filled the space. The Basti beast that was walking in the blood tide was actually submerged in the gorgeous blood flower petals. A 7-star magic guide fairy dares to compete with an 8-star magic guide fairy? Vlad's voice became high-spirited again. The vampire count responded to his command and kept summoning blood fiends from the sea of blood above and below to charge and self-explode, making the blood flower bloom even more fiercely. In the blink of an eye, his field of vision was completely submerged in blood. From Dake's perspective, he couldn't even see the shadow of the Basti beast. But he was not anxious at all. The fusion card that carried the Basti beast in his hand was still emitting a faint golden halo and was unusually stable. Although the Basti beast's mana was lost in the explosion, it was restored to full in an instant. Vlad's arrogance was built on ignorance. Stars were equivalent to levels, but the status of a magic guide fairy was determined by its user. The Basti beast was a magical elf with divinity. Although it was not a true god card, it could be distinguished from magical elves that were below the gods. If it was placed among the vampires, it would be equivalent to the true ancestor. If the vampire count had abandoned the power of the blood sea and fought the enemy with his claws and fangs, he might have been more of a threat to Bataille. There was a gap in their knowledge reserves, so what they saw was naturally different. However, the truth was right in front of his eyes. Even the stupidest person would be able to tell. The whole explosion lasted for a very long time. The vampire count's blood sea was about to dry up before it stopped under Vlad's command. However, as the blood splattered, the Basti beast's graceful body was revealed in front of everyone without a single speck of dust. It looked at Vlad, who was shocked because of this, with a playful gaze. Then, with a flick of its finger, a dark red stream of blood drilled out from its fingertip. It was more than 10 meters long with the wind and turned into a terrifying blood dragon as thick as a bucket. The blood of the blood dragon came from the blood fiends. After the Basti beast absorbed the vampire count's power, it transformed into a blood dragon with fresh blood as its body and the power of darkness as its core. The newly born blood dragon immediately let out a soundless but terrifying roar at Vlad. Vlad's originally condescending gaze suddenly became fierce and restrained. His face turned cold, and he suddenly shouted, "Vampire Count!" When the vampire count heard this, his originally arrogant and indifferent face suddenly became furious, and endless blood light surged all over his body. The sea of blood under his feet and above his head actually flowed to his raised right hand under his control. An extremely long blood-red scythe was thus forged. Death Harvest! The vampire count let out a roar. He actually raised the blood scythe high and pounced on the Basti beast. In the end, it still turned into a hand-to-hand battle. The Basti beast pursed her lips and smiled. She raised her right hand like a leopard's claw and put her blood-stained index finger into the veil. She licked it with her tongue, and there was a seductive look in her eyes. The blood dragon coiled above her head leaned down and charged toward the vampire count. The vampire count raised the blood scythe high and slashed at the dragon's head without fear. The blood dragon suddenly opened its bloody mouth and bit at the blood scythe. Boom! The scythe's mouth. The dragon's teeth bit down. The blood scythe tried to cut the blood dragon, but the blood dragon bit the blade of the scythe. But after a moment of stalemate, the vampire count, who suddenly exerted his strength, broke through the dragon's teeth's clamp and slashed down, cutting off the dragon's blood from the corner of its mouth to its lower jaw. Roar! The vampire count, who finally achieved a little success, immediately let out a roar as if he was venting his anger. Vlad also laughed and said, "It's just a formality." At the same time, the vampire count had already broken the blood dragon into more than a dozen pieces. However, Vlad was right about one thing. The blood dragon was indeed just a formality. The Basti beast bent her finger, and the blood dragon that had been cut into more than a dozen pieces grew a head and a tail respectively, turning into more than a dozen smaller blood dragons. Then, they bit the vampire count's body from multiple directions. While these more than a dozen blood dragons were biting, they also turned their bodies into shackles, tightly binding the vampire count. One of them even climbed up his right arm that was holding the scythe, pulling off his right arm and binding it tightly. The more than a dozen blood dragons exerted force again, and the vampire count's scream rang out. Mia. Only then did the Basti beast walk in front of the vampire count with a smile. Then, she tiptoed slightly and raised her head slightly. Her beautiful face met the vampire count's eyes. Then, she raised her hand and pierced the vampire count's forehead with her sharp nails. The fingertip pierced through the pale and stiff skin, and a drop of blood actually flowed out. As soon as the drop of blood flowed out, it was sucked into the Basti beast's fingertip. She smiled sweetly and seductively. She exerted more force with her fingertip and pierced the vampire count's forehead. The vampire's blood immediately rolled out. Vlad probably didn't expect that the 8-star magic elf that he had paid a great price to refine, the vampire count, would actually lose to a 7-star magic elf. When the vampire count's blood was sucked clean by the Basti beast and he gradually became skin and bones, Vlad realized that he had lost the battle. He was more or less the type who could bend and stand tall. He was a coward when he should be. He was a coward when he should be. At this moment, he made a prompt decision. He didn't even have time to adjust his expression. After saying those harsh words, he suddenly fled backward. The light cavalry that was blocking that side just now stopped by the wall because of Dake's arrival, leaving a way for him to escape. In the process of fleeing, Vlad didn't forget to light up the last magic card. He threw the magic card that was suffused with a bloody light behind him, and a huge number of bats flew out from the card's surface in an endless stream. Then, like a swarm of bees, they pounced on the Basti beast and Dake. They looked just like real bats. But in fact, they were just a group of phantoms. They densely covered the entire passageway. Vlad's figure disappeared from Dark's eyes. But he immediately shouted, "Basti beast, catch him!" Meow. Basti let out a meow and casually tossed the vampire count who had been sucked dry to the side. Then, he exerted force with his feet and leaped onto the wall. Borrowing the momentum, he pounced forward and closed the distance between himself and Vlad. Vlad didn't need to turn his head to feel the approaching magic fairy. His expression was panicked, but his eyes were flashing with a fierce light. With Luo Boat's body, he couldn't exert any strength at all. If he was caught, he could almost imagine the miserable fate of being killed. But what was more terrifying was far from death. When Vlad parasitized Luo Boat's body, he already had a basic understanding of the intelligence of this era. He knew very well that he was very likely to be the last vampire. And in this Shang Malian Academy, there were indeed a few professors who were addicted to research. If he fell into the hands of those professors, it would be hard for him to die even if he wanted to. As demons, vampires were like fish on a chopping board in the eyes of some humans. Dissecting and researching them didn't have any psychological burden. So he couldn't be caught, even if he died. At this moment, the pride that had taken root in the depths of his soul had already risen. Vlad would rather die than become a fish on a chopping board. But it's still okay. He couldn't help but touch his chest, and forced a sinister smile on his panicked face. There's still one to accompany me to the grave. One for one, not a loss. But just as Vlad had made up his mind to take the enemy down with him, a ray of hope shone into his eyes. His best friend, White Gouda, suddenly rushed out from around the corner. At first, Vlad thought that White Gouda was also a part of the group that had surrounded him. But then he suddenly realized that if White wanted to make a move on him, he didn't have to go through so much trouble. The two were almost inseparable. If White had known that he was parasitized in Luo Boat's body, he would probably have been surrounded by those unfathomable professors. But since he didn't, Vlad's eyes flashed with a strange light, and the bloody light in his eyes quickly hid in the depths of his eyes. "White, run!" He rushed forward and grabbed White, who was gradually slowing down. Ha! Ha ha! White gasped for breath and hurriedly asked, "Luo Boat, why are you here?" "I've been discovered by the golems." Vlad rushed to the other side of the corner and hurriedly shouted, "I've been discovered by the golems too. Not only the golems, but also the bats." "Bats? Where did the bats come from?" White looked sideways and saw a swarm of bats blocking his vision. Vlad hurriedly said, "How would I know? Just run a little faster, I don't want to be locked up again." But in a place where White couldn't see, Vlad raised his left hand slightly and bent his 5 fingers into a claw. There was a bloody aura lingering around the claw, and it was filled with a threatening aura. Obviously, after obtaining a new hostage, he had more confidence. Luo Boat was a worthless person in his eyes, and he didn't even deserve to be used as a hostage. But his best friend White was the son of a hero, and was definitely a high-quality hostage. In fact, he quickly realized that the 7-star magical elf didn't chase after him. This made him immediately realize that his idea was completely correct. With the white Gouda in his hands, even the golden-haired youth would stop out of fear. After that, he only needed to. A trace of extreme greed suddenly flashed in Vlad's eyes. He had been enduring for a long time. The white Gouda was the most delicious food for a vampire with a normal sexual orientation. But in order to study hard and improve every day, he had been enduring, and enduring. Now that his parasitism had been discovered, he finally didn't have to endure anymore. First, transfer his soul to the white Gouda, and completely take over its body. Then, suck Luo Boat's blood clean, and replenish his energy. To absorb and digest the uniqueness of the white Gouda's body. Once the digestion was successful, he might be able to recover to his peak state, and even become stronger. At that time, he would have the power to break the barrier and escape from the academy. But it was a pity that his path to knowledge would be cut off because of this. In this extremely short period of time, Vlad had already thought of a follow-up. He felt as if he had escaped from a dangerous situation. Even when he ran forward hand in hand with White, it was as if there was a background music of "I am the wind, you are the sand" playing. The two turned and turned in the castle's passageways, and with their rich experience, they finally shook off the magic golem's pursuit. Vlad pulled White into a classroom and panted heavily. "We finally shook them off. Are you all right, White?" I'm fine. White's mouth flashed with a hint of green light, and said while supporting herself on her knees. After a while he asked in confusion, "Luo Boat, why are you outside?" Vlad's mouth curved into a smile. "I was curious, so I followed you out." "How was it?" "You're... he." A trace of embarrassment appeared on White's face, and she lamented, "Didn't you see? I was discovered by the magic golems as soon as I crossed the bridge. I managed to escape with great difficulty, but they told me." Vlad revealed a look of curiosity. "Told you what?" "White. She said she lost a game of truth or dare, and was forced to give me the chocolate. They were too much, and they even bet behind my back whether I would be asked out or not." Vlad couldn't help but reveal a look of astonishment, and he suddenly felt pity for this close friend of his. 2 in 1 4,000 plus. The cold weather caused the pipes to leak, and it took a whole day. The next 2 in 1 might be after 12 o'clock, but it will definitely happen. In short, overcome everything, and persevere is victory. Currently, the bounty has accumulated to 139 chapters, 2,000 words/chapter. As of 4:45 p.m. on January 1st of this year, 77 chapters have been released, and 62 chapters are left. There are 50 chapters planned for this month, and they are expected to be paid off before the Spring Festival. Good luck. Chapter 321. Of course. Pity couldn't feed him. Vlad wouldn't give up on his plan just because of a little pity. He only wanted to satisfy his curiosity. "Where's your girl? She didn't run away with you?" White slowly lowered his head and said sadly, "I lured the golem away for her. She should have returned before the curfew." Vlad's entire being was stunned. White Gouda was repaying evil with good for a woman who had cheated him of his feelings. Perhaps this was what a hero was like. Sigh. Vlad sighed and said to White, "Come closer. I have something to tell you." "What's the matter? Can't you say it directly?" White was curious, but he still moved closer. Vlad leaned down and whispered something into his ear, his head brushing past his neck. "What did you say?" White couldn't help but be puzzled. But Vlad had already opened his mouth. His fangs slowly elongated under the bloody light and aimed at White's neck. Vampire's fangs contained hormones that could paralyze a person's nerves, but Vlad was borrowing Luo Boat's body right now. His fangs hadn't completely transformed yet, so he had to take advantage of Vlad's unpreparedness to achieve his goal. Fortunately, White trusted Luo Boat very much. Vlad's unusual movements didn't raise his guard in the slightest. Just a little bit more, just a little bit more. Vlad couldn't help but salivate. Before the saliva could drip down, he opened his mouth and bit down with all his might. Ah! His sharp fangs instantly pierced his skin. Werther let out a blood-curdling scream. Then, he almost instinctively grabbed at Vlad's arm. Vlad was already on top of him. Relying on Robert's greater strength and weight than Victor, he used his arms to clamp down on Victor's head and neck, slamming him to the ground. "Luo Boat! What are you doing? Luo Boat!" White still hadn't realized what was going on, and asked desperately. However, there was no way Vlad could pull back now that he had succeeded. The incomparably sweet blood flowed into his mouth along with his fangs, and he was filled with incomparable pleasure. The unique scent of blood within it made him feel as if he had just received a shower of rain. His entire body began to tremble because of this. "Don't move!" Vlad let out a gloomy roar from the corner of his mouth. His body's strength continued to soar after absorbing White's blood, and he was actually suppressing him to the point where he couldn't move at all. White's strength was like a joke in front of him, unable to cause any waves at all. But at this moment, White finally noticed something strange. "You're not Luo Boat. Who are you?" "Ha ha ha." Vlad kicked off White's card pack and began to devour White's blood. As he sucked more and more blood, the fangs in his mouth gradually turned red. When the fangs became as red as gemstones, Vlad's eyes turned red. Vlad's eyes instantly turned red, and his soul, which hadn't completely taken over Robert's body, began to float. The fangs in White's neck became a bridge for his soul to transfer. Vlad let out a final wild laugh, then dove headfirst into White's body. His eyes lost focus for a moment. A blinding red light suddenly blossomed from the fangs. The stench of blood permeated the air and filled the entire classroom. I'm in." After forcing his way into White's body, Vlad immediately felt a sense of comfort seeping into his soul. If Luo Boat's body could be described as a brick house, then White's body was a magnificent castle. Lying in White's body was like lying on a large, soft bed, and one couldn't help but want to sink into it. Vlad realized that he was wrong. He shouldn't have endured hiding in Luo Boat's body for the sake of studying. He should have immediately transferred into the body of the hero's son after avoiding the initial detection. The body of the hero's son was simply the most suitable breeding ground for vampires. Vlad even felt his soul sublimate within a few seconds of entering White's body. So comfortable. It was simply too comfortable. While Vlad was immersed in White's body, Luo Boat, who had regained control of his body, slowly woke up from his deep slumber. He opened his eyes in a daze. The situation in front of him made him feel like he was in a dream. But the taste of blood in his mouth couldn't be faked. "I've been possessed by Vlad, and I even bit White?" Luo Boat suddenly woke up from White's body. He stared at White's neck as if he was possessed. The soreness all over his body almost made him fall. "Hey, Luo Boat." Suddenly, a wisp of light green wind blew past Luo Boat's ear. Luo Boat suddenly quivered. "White." He was very sure that the voice in his ear came from White Gouda. But wasn't White still lying under him? "Move back, Luo Boat." The cold wind by his ear made Luo Boat gradually wake up. He resisted the soreness and unconsciously got up from White's body. Then he took a few steps back. Just at that moment, 6 dots suddenly lit up on the ceiling of the classroom. Luo Boat blinked, and the 6 dots turned into 6 slender pillars of light. The pillars of light passed through the ceiling of the classroom and continued to fall. Apart from a trace of light, there wasn't a single sound. When Luo Boat focused his eyes, the 6 pillars of light had already pierced the floor. From the ceiling to the floor, a white curtain of light appeared above and below. The 6 slender pillars of light silently formed a complete cage. The White Gouda and Vlad, who had burrowed into its body, were both trapped in this 6-pillar light prison. When Vlad successfully took over the White Gouda's body and opened his eyes to the world, there was already an unbreakable curtain of light between him and Luo Boat outside the cage. "Stay away, Luo Boat." The voice in his ear reminded him again. Luo Boat stared at the white in the cage of light, his eyelids twitching. But in the end, he chose to believe the voice in his ear and continued to retreat. Meanwhile, the white Gouda, in the cage of light, was at a loss. Vlad had successfully parasitized it. But the ascension he wanted didn't appear. This loss even overpowered the fear of being trapped in the cage of light. What's going on? What went wrong? Vlad slowly sat up in the cage of light. His gaze swept around aimlessly. Suddenly, a familiar figure appeared in his field of vision. At the back door of the classroom, the golden-haired boy who was controlling the cat goddess walked into the classroom at a moderate pace. Luo Boat, whom he had parasitized before and hadn't had the time to eat, was ecstatic at the appearance of the golden-haired boy. "Dake, are you helping me?" His naturally loud voice shook the air. It made Vlad a little dizzy. What's going on? What went wrong? He clenched his head again and tried to recall. Then, a flash of light appeared. But then he saw the golden-haired boy pull out a magic card that emitted a golden halo from his sleeve. The golden halo was the symbol of a gold card. Dake Dimeng walked into the classroom. Although his steps were calm, he was actually very cautious. As expected, Vlad walked into the trap. But vampires were the most cunning creatures. Once they let their guard down, they would bare their fangs. Last time, in the secret passage, he had let Vlad self-destruct to escape. This time, Dake didn't want to have any more accidents. He wouldn't act rashly before the two professors arrived. Facing the surprised Luo Boat, Dake pointed at him with the empty magic card. "Stop, Luo Boat." Ah! Although Luo Boat was surprised, he still obediently stopped. At this time, the two were separated by a relatively safe distance. Dake carefully observed Luo Boat and the white in the six-pillar light prison. Suddenly he said, "Professor, it's time to come down." Then, Professor Ka Zayer's voice came from the wisp of light green wind around Luo Boat's ear. "I'm coming." Only a moment later, a hexagram magic array lit up on the ceiling again. The entire ceiling was penetrated by the light of the magic array. Professor Kaiser, who was directly above, jumped directly into the magic circle. He passed through the extremely thick floor and jumped into the classroom in one leap. Professor Ka Zayer waved his magic wand in time, wrapping the wings of the wind around his feet. Then, he stepped on the wind and landed between Dake and Luo Boat. He looked up again. Professor Shi Erfu also landed with the white Gouda. Professor Ka Zayer's sudden appearance made Luo Boat feel a little relieved. At this time, he didn't realize that he had broken the restriction. But with the appearance of Professor Shi Erfu and the white Gouda, Luo Boat turned his head back and forth as if he had lost his mind. His eyes kept jumping between the white and the white in the six-pillar light prison. His mouth was as big as an egg. After seeing the two professors arrive, Dake was slightly relieved. He said directly, "Professor, let's confirm it first." Professor Ka Zayer frowned and suddenly pointed his magic wand at Luo Boat. A flash of magic instantly illuminated his whole body. Luo Boat's body trembled, and the last trace of blood in his body was dispersed by the magic power. Professor Ka Zayer nodded and then turned to the six-pillar light prison. "Ka Zayer, can your barrier work?" Professor Shi Erfu asked. Professor Ka Zayer casually replied, "Shi Erfu, you have asked this question many times. It can imprison souls." "That's good." Professor Shi Erfu frowned. "The existence of souls is too vague. I don't know what to do with them." Professor Ka Zayer nodded and said, "It's the same. I only know a little more about souls because of some things. In this aspect, some shamans of the beasts are more proficient. For example, the owls of the bird clan can see souls at night. However, I have used this six-pillar light prison to capture souls before, so there shouldn't be any problems. If there's anything you want to ask it while it's still alive." Shi Erfu threw white to Luo Boat and then walked to the six-pillar light prison. Ka Zayer and Dake also approached. After standing still, White patted Luo Boat's shoulder and whispered, "Are you okay, Luo Boat? I'm just a little tired. Luo Boat sighed and resisted the urge to ask what was going on. He sensed the atmosphere and knew that now was not the time to ask questions. White smiled bitterly and looked at himself in the six-pillar light prison. The shadow in his heart couldn't help but poke its head out. He whispered, "Don't mind it, Luo Boat. Think on the bright side. At least we don't have to be locked up." Doc followed the two professors and arrived in front of the six-pillar prison. Then, he heard Professor Shi Erfu ask, "Vlad? Where are you from?" Vlad looked up and glanced at him. A mocking smile appeared on his face and he snorted. "Dake. Professor, he might not know." Vlad's expression changed and he glared at him fiercely. However, this also confirmed Dake's speculation. Professor Shi Erfu frowned and immediately asked, "Vlad, who are you?" This time, Vlad turned his gaze away and stared at White in the distance. He was unwilling to give up. That wisp of spiritual light just now made him recall the magic elf that had once transformed into his appearance and engaged in a fierce battle with him. Now that he saw the real White Gouda, he realized that he was completely done for. The great vampire Vlad didn't even notice the difference between a human and a magic elf. Not only did he not notice it when he was sucking blood, he didn't even notice it after he was parasitized. It was too terrifying. Vlad was terrified of this kind of transformation that made no difference. Parasitizing a magic elf was equivalent to parasitizing a magic clump. Although this magic clump was very, very special, and there were even parts of it that he couldn't analyze. But a magic clump was still a magic clump. Once the master of the magic elf cancelled the summoning, the magic clump would disappear completely. And Vlad, who was parasitizing it, could only turn back into a wisp of soul. Without a body, Vlad, whose soul was incomplete to begin with, could only be at the mercy of others. Thinking of this, Vlad didn't feel any fear. He was going to die anyway. It was better to die before he was deprived of the ability to commit suicide. It was better to die before he became a fish on the chopping board. He had to die a little more vigorously. He couldn't let others look down on vampires. Vlad propped himself up and slowly straightened his body. He sneered at Dake and the two professors. "You've won this time. But the glory of vampires will never disappear. Even if one of me dies, there will still be thousands of me. This world will eventually be embraced by the demons." "Dake!" Professor Shi Erfu immediately shouted. Dake's thoughts moved, and he injected a wisp of magic power into his fingertips. The White Gouda, in the six-pillar light prison, suddenly melted. But if Vlad wanted to commit suicide, this alone wouldn't be able to stop him. His soul disintegrated in an instant. Puff. The resulting explosion was neither pleasant nor pleasant to the ears. 2-in-1 4,000+ monthly votes. Chapter 322. Come Back, Polymorph. Dake lifted the magic card and cancelled the summoning. The polymorph that had melted into a puddle of liquid gradually turned into light and directly penetrated the six-pillar light prison, and went back into the magic card. Dake smiled and poked the polymorph that had returned to its original form on the card. The polymorph deserved to be the main reason why tonight's plan had gone so smoothly. From transforming into a girl to catching White, to transform, White seducing Vlad, the polymorph's acting could be said to be perfect. Especially the latter's acting was so difficult that even Dake himself didn't have the confidence to do it. However, the polymorph was indeed a magic fairy with the shapeshifter skill. It was gifted in imitation. When it acted as White, not only did it have to have the appearance, but it also had to cooperate with White's dubbing. It could be said that there was no room for mistakes. But speaking of dubbing, Dake was a little surprised. He didn't expect White's dubbing to be so perfect. He remembered the URL Vipkanchu 6 after thinking about it for a while. Dake looked up again. The wisp of wind given by Professor Shi Erfu shuttled through the golden hair from time to time, emitting a trace of green light. So the blessing of the wind fairy can be used to resist a disaster, and it can also be used to transmit sound? Professor Shi Erfu can even use it to replace vision, but that should be a high-level application. Dake thought for a while and refocused his attention on the six-pillar light prison. Although Vlad acted as if he had killed himself, the actual situation still needed to be tested. Considering the deceitful nature of vampires, perhaps it was some kind of trick. However, without the parasite, Vlad's ability was limited, and there was no way he could hide from Professor Ka Zayer's detection. Under the gaze of many people, Professor Ka Zayer walked to the front of the six-pillar light prison. He didn't feel that it was a pity that Vlad had killed himself. In order to prevent Vlad from escaping, they had already decided to send him on his way here. Now, it was just a matter of bringing it forward. Professor Ka Zayer raised his wand and pointed it at the light screen between the two pillars of light. Then, he chanted an incantation, and the tip of his wand lit up, causing ripples to appear on the light screen. Then, the tip of the magic wand pierced through the light. Professor Ka Zayer picked out a magic card from his left hand. Mana flowed between the magic card and the wand, and the power of the magic card was unleashed through the wand. Rings of light were constantly being released from the tip of the wand, spreading layer by layer to every corner of the light prison. About 3 minutes later, Professor Ka Zayer finally stopped. Professor Shi Erfu asked, "Ka Zayer, how is it going?" Professor Ka Zayer withdrew his wand and smiled. Confirmed death. However, its soul remains are still locked in the six-pillar light prison. Wait a moment. After that, he took out a glass bottle the size of a knuckle from his card bag and placed it in the light prison. Then, he began to collect the remains. Dake couldn't help but ask curiously, "Professor, are there remains of souls?" Professor Ka Zayer explained while fiddling with the bottle, "Of course, there are remains of souls. At the end of the day, both the soul and the body are carriers of consciousness. The meaning of death is the death of consciousness. If we bury a corpse in the earth, it will decompose in the earth. If we bury the remains of a soul in the wind, it will disappear in the wind." Doc seemed to have understood something. The world was different, and the rules were different. If one wanted to understand the rules of this world, they had to understand the contradictions and understand them. The essence of magic was idealistic. Only the death of the consciousness, the soul, was true death. Inside the six-pillar light prison, specks of light that looked like starlight appeared as Professor Ka Zayer cast a spell. Then, these soul remains were gathered in one place and ground into a pile of fine powder. Then, they were introduced into the small bottle. In the concept of alchemists, this kind of powder made from soul remains was also called soul powder. It was a very useful alchemy material. After all the soul powder was transferred into the small bottle, Professor Ka Zayer sealed the bottle with a layer of enchantment and closed the bottle cap. Then, he shook the bottle and looked at the shining powder inside. He handed it to Dake Dimming. "Tonight's vampire hunt was completed by you alone. This bottle of vampire's soul powder will be your reward." Dake reached out and took the bottle. His expression was slightly moved. Almost at the same time, in the tower shrouded in the middle of the night, in the dormitory of Professor of Astronomy, Mitya Bartholomew. Mitya Bartholomew was talking with a beautiful lady who had long blood-red hair tied up on top of her head. The two of them were wearing the same pajamas. The black velvet curtains were tightly drawn so that no light could penetrate through. It was late at night, but the two beautiful ladies were not sleepy at all. Placed between the two of them was... It wasn't a magic book. It wasn't a divination astrolabe either. It was a magic chess set. "Mitya, why do you think White likes this kind of unbalanced chess set?" The lady with blood-red hair was holding her cheeks. Her eyes were erratic. Her mind was obviously not on the chessboard. Mitya took the opportunity to eat one of the opponent's chess pieces and said, "Maybe because it's fun." Lady with red hair. Fun? Mitya. Yes, fun. Lady with red hair. She's still a child. Mitya. She's a child. Lady with red hair. She's 12 years old. She's already at the age where she can start thinking about giving birth. Mitya, times have changed, Lia. The red-haired lady who was called Lia sighed slightly. She was about to continue lamenting about the passage of time when suddenly, her heart skipped a beat. She stood up. Mitya was puzzled. What's wrong? Lia smiled mysteriously. She took out a glass bottle with a diameter of 13 centimeters from a low cabinet next to the bookcase and carefully placed it on the cabinet. What is this? Mitya couldn't help but look at it curiously. She saw that the bottle was filled with some kind of special liquid. The liquid was transparent and there were a lot of fine bubbles floating inside. Although Mitya lived in a dormitory with this Lady Lia, she never invaded her privacy. She was puzzled. When did you get this thing? Shoo. Lia raised her index finger and motioned for her to be quiet. She held the bottle and shook it slightly. The liquid inside the bottle swayed with the shaking of the bottle. The bubble-like substance in the liquid came into contact with each other and slowly fused together. In the end, it fused into a fist-sized bubble. Sure enough. Lia stared intently at the bubble, her expression exhilarated. However, Mitya was completely confused by what she saw. She couldn't help but ask again. So, what is this? Lia straightened her body and finally answered. This is a soul. Mitya's puzzled expression turned into astonishment. A soul? Yes. Lia sneered. I cut off some soul fragments and put them in a culture tank to make something similar to a lich's phylactery. Once the main body dies. Mitya. Whose soul? Is he dead now? Lia's expression became gentle again. She just shook her head and said, This is a secret. It's a secret, Mitya thought for a moment and suddenly moved closer. She grabbed Lia's arm and shook it. What secret is so important? Tell me, I won't tell. But Lia shook her head again. I'm not worried that you will tell. Well, let's continue playing chess. This game is only halfway done. Inside the castle's classroom, Dake carefully observed the soul powder in the bottle. The soul powder of the vampires was obviously a very precious material, but he didn't know how to use it. Put it away first, Professor Zayer said. Dake nodded and stuffed the small bottle into the compartment of his card bag. The whole matter seemed to have finally come to an end. But in fact, it didn't meet their expectations 100%. After confirming the existence of Vlad, the main difficulty in eliminating him was how to get him out of Luo Boat's body. Tonight, they used a method that didn't seem so straightforward. On one hand, it was to increase their safety. On the other hand, it was to spread the vampire hunt posture and let some people feel that there was an opportunity to take advantage of. However, the former task was indeed achieved, but the latter was completely disappointed. Professor Zayer and Professor Shi Erfu set up layers of network on the second floor of the castle, but they didn't find any trace of the invisible man. Therefore, they couldn't help but feel a little regretful. The vampire Vlad was eliminated by them just like that. At this moment, even though the two professors felt that it was too smooth, they couldn't figure out what they missed. In order to ensure that the beginning and the end were completely cleaned up, Professor Zayer didn't immediately return. He began to control the golems on the second floor to eliminate every corner of the castle. Professor Shi Erfu was responsible for sending the 3 students back to the dormitory. They first went to the Night Academy Tower. Professor Shi Erfu was at the bridge in front of the tower, criticizing and educating White and Luo Boat in a harsh tone. But later on, her tone gradually softened. She apologized for Luo Boat's experience tonight and praised White's dubbing. Finally, she gave some credits as a reward to appease the students. As for the corresponding confidentiality requirements, of course, she also mentioned. Dake watched Professor Shi Erfu's entire process. After she sent White and Luo Boat into the tower, he walked with her to the Noble Academy Tower. Without White and Luo Boat, the two spoke with less scruples. Professor Shi Erfu said in a deep voice, "The possibility that the other party's target is the vampire Vlad has decreased." Dake couldn't help but nod. It seems so. In addition, the possibility that Ophelia Bullard is in the academy has also decreased. Professor Shi Erfu couldn't help but sigh. That's right. Since the reason why Luo boat saw Ophelia in the fog has been found. No, that's not right. So, Vlad knows Ophelia? Dake, it's not strange that a vampire knows the last princess of the Blood Clan. Professor Shi Erfu pondered and said, That's true. But would he be so impressed that he saw it in a love divination? Dake, Professor, it's a kind of guidance and mapping of thoughts, using a combination of speech and magic technology. I'm saying that he might have thought of the Scarlet Blood concubine at that time. Professor Shi Erfu, so, why would he think of the Scarlet Blood concubine at that time? Dake couldn't help but stop and raise his head. That's a problem. Professor Shi Erfu also stopped. The moonlight shone on her light golden hair, making it seem ethereal. She deliberated for a moment and said, This matter needs to be considered at length. However, the existence of the Invisible Man has always been a problem, but since he didn't appear until Vlad's soul died, logically, we can temporarily separate his purpose from Vlad's existence. If we want to draw him out now, I'm afraid we can only restart the key plan. Dake shook his head slightly. This plan is too obvious. Since even Vlad's incident couldn't draw him out, the other party is either a harmless person or an extremely shrewd person. I'm afraid we won't be able to fool him with a fake key. Professor Shi Erfu sneered. Then let's make a real one. Since Vlad has been proven not to be in the secret passage can't be closed forever. Dake thought for a moment and suddenly had an idea. He said, Professor, I've always thought that creating a key to break the seal of the secret passage doesn't make much sense. Why don't we make a set of access cards? Professor Shi Erfu said in surprise, Access cards. Dake nodded. Access cards. Only people with access cards can enter the secret passage. This way, we can prevent unpredictable changes due to too many people in the secret passage, and we can effectively take advantage of the uniqueness of the secret passage. It's like you said. The existence of the secret passage is part of the Shang Molian, and it can't be closed forever. Professor Shi Erfu thought carefully for a long time and said, That does seem to be the case. After all these years, not a single one of us has thought of this. Dake said, Maybe from a different perspective. From the perspective of the professors, they should be more worried that the students will be in danger in the secret passage. That's why they want to make use of it, but they naturally reject it. That's why they didn't think in this direction. You're right. Professor Shi Erfu nodded. How about this? After we've dealt with Vlad, I'll talk to RTI about this possibility. Dake said, This is indeed a decision that needs to be taken seriously. I hope you can be more open-minded, Principal. Professor Shi Erfu couldn't help but smile. I see. You're the one who wants to enter the secret passage, aren't you? Dake raised his head and looked at her without any hesitation. That's right. Professor Shi Erfu's back was facing the moonlight, but her smile was brighter than the moonlight. 2 in 1 4,000 plus. Chapter 323. It was already late at night, and it was indeed not a good time to talk in detail. Dake Dimeng and Sarah Shi Erfu continued to walk forward. Not long after, the two arrived in front of the tower of the aristocrat house. The eyes of the feathered serpent magic statue had opened at some point, and the moon on the horizon was reflected in its eyes. Professor Shi Erfu and the feathered serpent magic statue looked at each other, and then it closed its eyes again. Dake successfully pushed open the door of the tower and said to Professor Shi Erfu, Good night, Professor. Professor Shi Erfu responded, Good night. The common lounge behind the curfew was quiet and cold. Dake stepped in, and the door behind him closed automatically. The magic lamps on the wall and the flames in the fireplace lit up one after another as if to express their welcome. Remember in a second, https://m Vipkanchu. VIP Dake's expression changed slightly, and he suddenly wanted to sit in this empty common lounge for a while. Then, he casually summoned a few one-star magic guiding fairies and sat in front of the fireplace for half an hour. Only when his heart and body became warm did he return to the dormitory with the magic elves in satisfaction. After entering the dormitory, he opened Paradise and summoned the other magic elves one by one. As the space in the dormitory gradually filled up, the warmth in his heart also overflowed. The sweat on his back could finally quietly flow out. In fact, in tonight's hunt, especially in the second half of the one-on-one confrontation with the vampire Vlad, although he looked calm, only he knew the nervousness in his heart. After all, he was facing a real vampire. A demon whose methods were unknown and who had no qualms about killing people. Even with the blessing of the wind spirit, and the two professors holding down the fort, there was always a what-if, just in case. If one accidentally messed up, Luo boat might be in danger. Fortunately, everything went very smoothly. Dake spat out a mouthful of turbid air, then took out a change of clothes and walked into the bathroom. First, he filled the bathtub with water, then took a shower to wash up. After washing up, he soaked his entire body in the bathtub. As the hot water slowly flowed into his body, the muscles and bones in his limbs relaxed. Dake couldn't help but feel sleepy. Once he closed his heavy eyelids, he couldn't open them again. His breathing gradually stabilized. When he woke up again, it was already 6 o'clock in the morning. Dake slowly sat up from the bed and looked down at his neatly dressed pajamas, wondering how he got into bed. Carat Omega Carat, Fairy Ibu coiled her 2-ribbon antennae around him, as if asking for praise. She tried to make Dake forget the mistake she made on Valentine's Day by sticking to him. But in reality, Dake had long forgotten about it. He lovingly stroked the soft hair on Fairy Ibu's head, and couldn't help but smile. A new day had arrived. The vampire hunting incident did not cause much of a stir in the academy. It was a wise choice to set the hunting time after the curfew. Although some of the students had sensed something strange in the castle, there was a layer of curfew blocking the entrance, which made them think twice before going out to investigate. So in the end, no one really discovered the truth of the matter. And of course, the people involved in the incident couldn't say anything about it. There were only 2 classes on Friday the next day. One was a class on duels, and the other was a class on magical beasts. Professor Pawa Cheong-si was talking about the theory of duels in the class. Dake had already finished self-studying that part, and he spent most of his time observing Luo Boat. That was because in some sense, Luo Boat could actually be considered a patient. But after observing in that class, Dake found that Luo Boat hadn't changed much. Vlad's influence on him had been subtle. It had been guided, not forced, by brainwashing. So Vlad's departure didn't immediately turn Luo Boat back to his original form. That was a good thing. But for Luo Boat, there should be an even bigger gain. The 4 magic cards that Vlad left behind were still with him. The professors hadn't thought of taking back the 4 magic cards for the time being. This meant that Luo Boat had successfully bypassed the school rules and obtained 4 extremely powerful magic cards out of thin air. Among them, the value of the secret ritual card that could summon the vampire count was even more inestimable. It was like he had suddenly won 100 million lottery, and that lottery ticket was picked up. Unless one day, the professors suddenly remembered and restricted it, otherwise, he would have made a huge profit. But at that moment, Luo Boat still didn't realize his good luck. His focus was on something else. White. Luo Boat touched the tip of his pen to the last word and turned to White, whispering, "Look, is this prophecy of mine wrong?" Prophecy. White looked at his notebook and read, "Your life, the fate of the chess piece breaks and the person dies," at the same time. Dake also remembered this prophecy. He opened his notebook and extracted this prophecy. He couldn't help but be surprised. The chess piece that Professor Midya mentioned in this prophecy is exactly the same as the matter of Luo Boat being parasitized by Vlad. A chess piece is a puppet, and Luo Boat has indeed become Vlad's puppet. In that kind of situation, if it wasn't handled properly, Luo Boat might really have died. So, is this a real prophecy, or a pure coincidence? Although Professor Midya had repeatedly emphasized that her words were not a prophecy. But if one of them came true, people couldn't help but think that the others were also true, and thus fall into a circle of thinking. Perhaps, this was the power of a prophet. Next, the study of magical beasts wasn't too big of a problem. Professor Nini once again captured a monster from the dungeon as a teaching demonstration. Although the students were yelling, they were actually enjoying it. After Professor Nini finished the class task, she happily said, "During this period of time, we have already met many monsters. Next, I will bring you even more interesting monsters to explain. When the theoretical foundation is solid enough, I will apply to Professor Shi Erfu for a day trip to the dungeon. I really hope it will be approved." A day trip to the dungeon? The little magisters who had been shouting just now suddenly quieted down. If it was said that their understanding of the Shang Malian Academy's dungeon was only superficial before, now that they had received Professor Nini's lecture, they had a vague understanding of the dangers inside the dungeon. Whether it was the soul-suckers or the cockatrice beasts, they could be called newcomer killers. For adventurers who didn't prepare in advance, their existence was very fatal. Moreover, the professor leading the team was Professor Nini. Although the little magister's impression of Professor Nini had gradually improved after such a long time of contact, this didn't mean that they would deny her unreliability. Therefore, the little magisters only had an extremely ominous premonition about this so-called day trip to the dungeon. Professor Shi Erfu won't approve her application, right? Many students looked at each other with a dry smile. Although Professor Nini always looked timid, it was not as if they had never seen how stubborn she could be when she really wanted to do something. At this time, they could only look forward to Professor Shi Erfu. Friday afternoon. Dake originally wanted to go to Traveler Street to buy some tools and materials for wood carving. Perhaps he could buy the materials for the flower card in advance. However, as soon as he arrived at the castle gate, the wisp of breeze hidden in his hair flew out and intertwined with another wisp of breeze coming towards him. Professor Shi Erfu's voice came from that wisp of breeze. "Come to my office." Doc paused for a moment and said, "Coming." He had no choice but to return. When he arrived at Professor Shi Erfu's office, there was already someone else inside. He knocked on the door and found that it was indeed Professor Ka Zaire. Professor Ka Zaire looked quite leisurely, which meant that today's matter wasn't urgent. The faint fragrance of flowers floated in the office. There was a refreshing feeling in his heart. Dake walked into the office and closed the door behind him. Then he sat down next to Professor Ka Zaire. He glanced at Professor Shi Erfu, who was sitting behind the desk and marking homework, and said, "Do you have something to say to me?" Professor Ka Zaire poured tea for him and moved the dessert tray over. Then he said, "It's not a big deal. Didn't you talk to Shi Erfu about the access card last night? I think it's good." Dake seemed to understand something and said, "Did Principal Erti agree?" Professor Ka Zaire smiled and said, "He agreed. But the specifics haven't been decided yet." Dake picked up his teacup and removed the lid. He blew on it a few times and said, "Indeed, this isn't something that can be solved quickly. The design of the access card, its function, how to distribute it, how many to distribute it, and who to distribute it to. These are all points that need to be carefully considered." Professor Ka Zaire said, "Principal Erti wants the access card to be made into a branch card. Not only can it receive notifications from the school, but it can also be bound to the user. It's best to install a secret realm escape device function." Dake, access card with a real name system? Real name system? Professor Ka Zaire nodded and said, "That's a good idea. In short, each access card can only correspond to one person. By looking at the access card's usage record, we can know who entered the secret passage. If there are any problems in the future, it'll be easy to hold them accountable. Dake, with the secret realm escape device function, it'll be safer." Professor Ka Zaire said, "That's true. We don't want to see people get trapped in the secret passage because they get lost." Dake, but wouldn't the craftsmanship of the access card be very high? Professor Ka Zaire smiled. The craftsmanship is high, so the chances of it being copied are low. Also, it's best to have as few access cards as possible. Especially in the early stages of the experiment, only 1 or 2 access cards will be enough. Also, like you said, we need to set a threshold to obtain access cards. What the principal means is that since we're in the school, we should use the school's rules, a duel. A duel. Dake was a little surprised. Was Principal A. also a dual brain? However, Professor Zayer continued, a duel is very fair and reasonable, and it won't seem deliberate. If the invisible person wants to enter the secret passage, then find a way to do it himself or let others fight for it. If he chooses to steal or rob after the competition, that's fine too. At the end of the day, the original intention of the access card was to lure the snake out of its hole. Compared to a key that specialized in breaking barriers, the access card was obviously more reliable. As for the difference in grades, Professor Zayer also had his own considerations. The initial plan is to give out 2 access cards, one for grades 1 to 3, and one for grades 4 to 6. If you want, you can also participate in the competition. Dake's mouth was half open, and he felt like he had shot himself in the foot. Does this mean that if I want the access card, I have to compete with the 2nd and 3rd grades? Professor Zayer blinked. The experience of failure is also a type of experience. Dake. Okay. Professor Zayer. Of course, it's still in the planning stage. Although the original intention is to lure out the invisible person, this will also help the school's management of the secret passage, so it can definitely be implemented. Once we start giving out access cards, the original intention will become convenient. Also, we can spread the news first. Maybe someone will come and steal it from me. Dake. I hope so. The current situation was more or less like that. Even if there were adjustments later, it shouldn't change much. In short, Dake found that he could only temporarily give up on the idea of entering the secret passage in the 1st grade. The 3rd grade was full of crouching tigers and hidden dragons, and the possibility of snatching access cards from them was slim. Instead of pinning his hopes on this, it was better to wait for the access cards to be given out later. The school couldn't just give out 2 access cards. There were still many opportunities later. Dark himself also had expectations for the issuance of the access card. The ideal situation was, having access cards would become a symbol of elite. There wouldn't be many of them, but there wouldn't be few either. This group of people had high self-control and the ability to deal with danger. They would be able to develop the secret passage after entering it. 10 minutes later, Professor Shi Erfu also stopped writing and joined the discussion between the two. In the end, they even discussed the face and style of the access card, and almost forgot about the invisible person. Sometimes, the professor's thinking was really unconstrained and creative. Dake benefited a lot just by discussing unrelated magic technology with them. By the time he left the office, the sky was already dark. Dake didn't go to Traveler's Street again. Instead, he used the night to finish his homework. The next Saturday, he finally had time to go out and began to buy a lot of things. Now, he already had a total of 50,000 credits in his school card. When he squandered them, it really felt like he was rich. Therefore, when he passed by the ancient goblin bookstore, he couldn't help but stop. Isn't this Senior Angelia? 2 in 1 4,000 plus. 8,000 completed today. Looking for monthly votes. Chapter 324. In the quiet and tidy bookstore street, this ancient goblin bookstore that looked like it had been put together by a few pieces of rotten wood seemed out of place. The old goblin, whose skin was wrinkled enough to squeeze flies to death, wore a tattered jacket that exposed cotton lint. He held a similarly tattered book and shouted loudly. Rather than saying that he was selling books, it was more like he was selling groceries. Since the students were already used to it, they could just wipe the dirt off the cover of the book after picking it out. Then they could just make do with it. Most of the books in the bookstore only cost 1 or 2 credits. The more expensive ones cost around 10 credits. However, Dake had often heard people say that the books in this ancient goblin bookstore were especially expensive. Some of the loaned copies that were auctioned could even be sold for over 100 credits. Clearly, this was a place where only those who truly loved books, or those who had a certain amount of credits to spare, would come to look for books. Dake actually didn't love books that much, so he hadn't patronized this place before. However, Angelia Hudson was a frequent customer of the ancient goblin bookstore. Especially since there was a way to obtain credits recently, she came even more frequently. The first website was https://m Vipcanshu VIP. Thus, it wasn't a coincidence that Dake met her here. However, the two of them didn't have much interaction, so Dake didn't take the initiative to strike up a conversation. He just walked into the bookstore very casually. Unlike the hustle and bustle at the entrance, the bookstore was relatively quiet inside. There was a faint woody fragrance everywhere. The clerk at the counter wasn't a goblin. Instead, she was a lady of the long ears race. Apart from a pair of long, furry ears that hung down to her shoulders, there were no other characteristics of a different race. This was the so-called long ears race. When Dake walked into the store, this lady of the long ears race had pulled down her long ears and placed them under her chin, covering both sides of her face. She was lying on the table, looking outside with a pair of lifeless eyes. Perhaps it was because she was too noisy or too cold. It was Dake's first time seeing a living long ears. He couldn't help but take another look. Then, he was glared at. Looks like a little sister with a bad temper. With this thought in mind, he walked to the bookshelf with the art sign and flipped through it casually. Since he was already here, he wanted to find some useful books. In the art category, most of the books were related to paintings, but some of them were related to sculpting. His main focus was on carving, preferably wood carving. A few minutes later, he found a thick book with the keyword wood carving at the bottom of the bookshelf. He squatted down and took it out to read. Using some strength, he pulled the book out. Then, as he stood up, he shook it hard, and a large amount of dust was shaken out. It could be seen that the book had been at the bottom of the bookshelf for more than a year or two. After brushing off the dust on the cover of the book, Dake read the title carefully. Fondy's Wood Carving Art. Who is Fondy? Doc couldn't help but blink. Van Gogh, on the other hand, knew a little about it. He was a painter of sunflowers. But Fan Shao, he was a performance artist during the war. I didn't know he could sculpt. A soft voice suddenly sounded from behind him. Dake turned his head slightly and saw Angelia walking up to him. She asked casually, "Are you interested in wood carving?" Dake smiled. "A little. Senior Hudson, it's a pleasure to meet you." Angelia reached out and pulled at her long bangs. She said expressionlessly, "That wasn't what you were thinking when you saw me just now, was it?" Dake's heart skipped a beat, but his expression remained natural. "Not at all. I just didn't want to disturb you. Speaking of which, this Fondy isn't a sculptor, but a performance artist? I don't know if he's a sculptor, but he's a performance artist." Anglia nodded and said, "Otherwise, have you ever seen a lunatic running naked on a battlefield full of corpses after a battle?" Dake lowered his head and looked at the book, Fondy's Wood Carving Art, and replied, "Actually, I haven't even seen a battlefield." Angelia picked up the book in her hands and looked at it from the corner of her eyes. Doc flipped open Fondy's Art of Wood Carving. The first page repeated the title of the book, the author, and a sentence from the author. "There is nothing more beautiful than the human form. Therefore, we give the human form to our gods." This doesn't sound like something a lunatic who likes to run around naked would say. Dake looked at the line and felt that it made sense. The form of the gods was uncertain. Many gods could even switch between different forms freely. However, humans often imagined the gods they believed in as pure human forms. The extreme of this imagination was the core of the saint's faith, saint. Of course, before he confirmed it, Doc couldn't determine whether it was a figment of his imagination or reality. After all, the gods had fallen a long time ago. In short, while he was thinking, he flipped to the next page. He glanced at the table of contents marked with chapter numbers and continued to read. Then he saw the first section of the first chapter, The Beauty of Softness. What was drawn in the book was a beautiful human body carved out of a kind of white wood. The entire human body was in a posture of leaning back into the shape of a pancake. Every detail of the human body could be seen clearly. Dake was startled and quickly looked away. He wasn't shy. He was just worried about Bliss +1. But after looking away, he realized that it was not his private time, so he awkwardly closed the book, Fondy's Art of Wood Carving. Then, he looked at Angelia, who was beside him. Her long bangs covered her forehead, making her look rather low-key. But to Dake's surprise, she didn't react shyly like a girl. Instead, she looked more interested. "Is this Fondy's work?" Angelia blurted out. "I didn't expect a performance artist to have such advanced carving skills. Do you want this book? If you don't want it." While Dark was surprised, he subconsciously said, "Yes, I do." "Is that so?" Angelia felt rather regretful. "Then after you finish reading it, can you lend it to me? I can pay you the same as renting a book." Dake said, "Forget about the payment. Wait for me to finish reading it." Angelia immediately said, "Okay, thank you." Dake finally bought Fondy's Wood Carving Art. Of course, it wasn't because Angelia was beside him. After careful consideration, he realized that this wood carving book was indeed helpful to him. Although there were many types of armament, the most common one was the full-body armor. The foundation of making armor, especially the tight soft armor, naturally had to conform to the human body structure. The most important thing to learn new knowledge was to build a good foundation. From the basics to the high end, one couldn't just hope for a castle in the sky. He had almost zero foundation now, and he had to learn by himself. It would be too difficult to jump directly to armor making. Therefore, he would start with human carving. Moreover, Fondy's Wood Carving Art didn't only talk about human carving. There were also many subhuman carvings. For example, the carving of orcs. If he could master the carving of orcs, then he could naturally master the body structure of animals. In short, this book was unexpectedly comprehensive. After buying Fondy's Wood Carving Art, Dake didn't stay in the ancient goblin bookstore for long. He quickly said goodbye to Angelia and continued to collect materials on Traveler's Street. When it was close to evening, he summoned the Delu beast from the dormitory. With its help, he carried a trailer-like package back to the dormitory. The door of dormitory 201 was like a huge mouth, only in and not out. Dake opened the package and sorted the materials inside. Then he took a deep breath and went to the bathroom to wash his body. After he felt refreshed, he lay on the bed and started reading Fondy's Wood Carving Art. Although he subconsciously avoided it at first. But in reality, with his current concentration, it wasn't too much of a problem to look at these exquisite but fake wood carvings. Dake Dimming wasn't a real ignorant youth. But just as he started to read the wood carving art, little Ibu and Fairy Ibu quietly sneaked into his bed and rubbed against his face, making him a bit troubled. Sure enough, not long after, the two magic guide fairies were attracted by this wood carving art book and refused to leave. Time passed quickly. From this Sunday onwards, Doc would officially embark on the path of learning wood carving. He started from the most basic material identification and familiarity with the tools and gradually became addicted. Boys seemed to have a natural interest in this type of manual work. The feeling of creating a work of art from your own hands was irresistible. And under his intentional indulgence, greed was steadily growing. However, nothing could be accomplished overnight. After a whole day, apart from a few more pieces of junk in the dormitory, he didn't have any results. But at night, he suddenly thought of something and summoned Meow Meow. In the end, Meow Meow arrived first, showing what a technical expert was. In just half an hour, Meow Meow had mastered all kinds of carving tools, and then, under the gaze of Dake and the rest of the magic guide fairies, it carved a lifelike fathead fish. Meow. After carving, Meow Meow bit the fathead fish and proudly put its hands on its waist. In this round, Dake Dimming suffered a crushing defeat. Perhaps this is a true genius? Jealousy +1. The great sin that slowly floated in his vision was jealousy, that he hadn't seen in a long time. Dake suddenly missed it and couldn't help but reach out to touch it. Of course, he touched nothing. After that, he looked at Meow Meow, who was showing off with a fathead fish in its mouth, and suddenly had a flash of inspiration in his mind. But just as it lit up, it went out again. It was like a scratch in his heart, making him want to catch it but unable to. What did I think of just now? Dake sat down on the spot and thought hard. But sometimes, the more he wanted to remember, the harder it was to catch the clue. He was troubled for an entire night, but he still couldn't catch that glimmer of inspiration. A new week, with the sound of Professor Shi Erfu's lecture, the curtains opened. The tale of Valentine's Day completely disappeared. The students refocused on their studies. Dake also regained his daily rhythm. He shortened the time he spent learning wood carving and only studied for 3 hours at night. Different from before, every time he returned to the dormitory, he would summon Meow Meow, and let the little fiend and the Diru beast, who had the best grasp of words, take turns to teach it. And every night, during the 3 hours of wood carving time, he would learn carving with it. Although all the wood carving knowledge that Meow Meow learned was taught to it by Dake, it was always able to grasp it very quickly and leave its master, Dake, far behind. Dake hadn't felt like this for a long time. In the field of wood carving, Meow Meow was like a rabbit, and he was the tortoise that raced with the tortoise. Only by persevering hard could he possibly reach the same end as the rabbit. But sometimes, it was actually a very lucky thing to have a shadow in front of you that you could chase. He could clearly feel that his learning efficiency was much higher than on Sunday. This week passed. He could already carve a decent human body with a piece of cork. Although it was still far from fine, it already had a complete structure. The proficiency of the technique was also constantly increasing. He finally looked like a person who was playing with carving. Although in this week, Meow Meow's chin was getting higher and higher, he didn't care. The last Sunday of February. 3 days before the end of February. 7:30 in the evening. Dake looked at the hand-carved puppet on the table, slowly closed the book, Fondy's Art of Wood Carving, and exhaled. In a week, I went from nothing to something. Actually, my progress is quite fast. If you don't compare it to Meow Meow. He smiled slightly, then put Fondy's Art of Wood Carving in the corner, and took out another book related to wood carving, Elven Craftsmanship, Wood Carving. In Fondy's Art of Wood Carving, there is a lot of content about more detailed human carving, and even the technique of softening materials to simulate the corresponding parts. But for now, I can't use these techniques. After mastering simple human carving, I can finally start to add armor to the outside of the human body. Let's start with the simplest dress. In this regard, Elven Craftsmanship, Wood Carving, should be able to help me more. Dake opened Elven Craftsmanship, Wood Carving to the page he needed, picked up the carving knife, and gestured at the puppet. After pondering for a while, he finally started. Let's carve a little dress first. 2 in 1 4000 plus. You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.